In the deepest hours of night, when most windows had gone dark and the streetlights cast their amber pools on empty sidewalks, there existed a building that breathed with the rhythm of forgotten stories. The Metropolitan Police Archives stood 5 stories tall, its red brick facade weathered by decades of rain and wind. Each window reflecting nothing but darkness back to the empty streets below. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune over rows upon rows of filing cabinets, each one a repository of human moments frozen in time. The air carried the weight of old paper, the mustiness of manila folders that had been opened and closed countless times, and the faint metallic scent of filing cabinet keys that had turned in locks for years beyond counting. On the 3rd floor, in Section M of the archives, a particular cabinet stood slightly apart from the others. Cabinet 347M had been installed in 1987, its olive green paint now dulled to the color of old sage. The cabinet contained files from cases that had been officially closed but never quite resolved. Investigations that had simply faded into the bureaucratic twilight where paperwork goes to rest. The building's night security guard, a man whose footsteps echoed softly through the corridors every 2 hours, had walked these halls for 8 years. He had learned the building's rhythm, the way the old radiators clicked and whispered, the subtle creak of settling foundations, the almost imperceptible shift in air pressure when the ventilation system cycled through its nightly routine. But he had never opened the filing cabinets. That was not his role. His role was simply to witness the building's quiet persistence through the hours when the city pretended to sleep. In Cabinet 347M, drawer 3 from the top, approximately 60 files rested in their manila sleeves. Each file had been carefully labeled with a case number, a date, and a brief description written in the careful handwriting of clerks who had long since retired or moved on to other departments. The files were arranged chronologically, beginning with cases from the late 1980s and extending through the mid-1990s. A decade of mysteries that had been examined, documented, and ultimately filed away. File number 347M0089 contains 17 pages of reports concerning a series of break-ins that had occurred in the Riverside district during the winter of 1991. The investigating officers had noted the peculiar pattern of the intrusions. Nothing of significant value had ever been taken, but in each case, the intruder had rearranged furniture in subtle ways. A chair moved slightly to the left, a picture frame turned at a different angle, books reshuffled on a shelf. The reports documented 12 separate incidents over a 3-month period, each one meticulously photographed and described. The photographs, now faded to a sepia tone that made everything look older than it was, showed ordinary living rooms and bedrooms that had been gently disturbed. In one image, a coffee table bore the circular stains of glasses that had been moved just inches from their original positions. Another photograph captured a bookshelf where someone had clearly spent time rearranging the volumes, creating new patterns that the homeowners couldn't immediately identify but instinctively knew were wrong. Officer Margaret Chun had been assigned to the case, and her reports filled the majority of the file. Her handwriting was precise and methodical, each letter formed with the careful attention of someone who understood that these documents might be the only lasting record of events that had disrupted the quiet lives of ordinary citizens. She had interviewed each victim multiple times, documenting their growing unease as they realized that someone had been inside their most private spaces, touching their belongings, rearranging their lives in ways both subtle and profound. The victims had all lived alone. This detail appeared in Officer Chun's notes with increasing frequency as the investigation progressed. Elderly widows, divorced professionals, young adults who had recently moved to the city. Each break-in had occurred during daylight hours when the residents were at work or running errands. The intruder never took anything that would be missed immediately. No jewelry, no electronics, no cash. Instead, they seemed drawn to the intimate geography of solitary lives. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, age 73, had been the first to report the strange break-in. She lived in a ground-floor apartment on Maple Street, a tree-lined avenue where the autumn leaves collected in neat piles that neighborhood children loved to disturb on their walks home from school. Mrs. Hoffman had returned from her weekly grocery shopping trip to find her apartment unlocked, something she was certain she would never have forgotten to do, and her living room subtly altered. Investigation file contained her statement, typed on the old manual typewriter that had been standard equipment in the precinct during those years. The keys had struck the paper with varying intensity, creating a rhythm of dark and light letters that told their own story of the officer's careful attention to detail. Mrs. Hoffman had described standing in her doorway for nearly 10 minutes, scanning the room and feeling increasingly certain that something was wrong, even though she couldn't immediately identify what had changed. Her favorite armchair, a faded blue recliner that had been her late husband's preferred spot for reading the evening paper, had been moved approximately 6 inches closer to the window. The lamp beside it had been turned so that its shade faced a slightly different direction. The stack of magazines on the side table had been rearranged, not scattered or disturbed, but carefully restacked in a different order. Even her collection of ceramic figurines on the mantelpiece had been shifted. Each piece moved just enough to create new relationships between the familiar objects. Officer Chun had spent 3 hours in Mrs. Hoffman's apartment, documenting every detail with the patience of someone who understood that crime was often found in the smallest disruptions of normal life. She had photographed the apartment from multiple angles, capturing not just the evidence of intrusion, but the broader context of a life lived quietly and with careful routine. The photograph showed a space that was clearly loved and maintained, where every object had its place and every placement had its meaning. The subsequent break-ins had followed a similar pattern. Mr. David Reeves, a divorced accountant who lived in a studio apartment on 4th Street, had returned from work to find his carefully organized desk transformed into a different kind of order. His papers had been restacked, his pens arranged in new configurations, his books moved to create spaces where no spaces had existed before. Like Mrs. Hoffman, he had stood in his doorway for long minutes, trying to understand what felt wrong about a space that looked almost exactly as he had left it. The file contained Mr. Reeves' statement as well, along with Officer Chun's notes from their interview. He had described the unsettling realization that someone had touched every item in his apartment, not with malicious intent, but with what seemed like curiosity or perhaps a desire to understand how he lived. His coffee mug had been moved from the left side of the sink to the right. His jacket had been rehung in the closet, but facing the opposite direction. Even his bed had been made, but with the pillows arranged differently than his own careful habit. As winter deepened and the break-ins continued, Officer Chun's reports began to reveal a growing fascination with the psychological dimensions of the case. She had consulted with criminal psychologists and social workers, trying to understand what might motivate someone to enter private spaces without stealing anything, to touch and rearrange the intimate details of strangers' lives without leaving any obvious message or threat. The file contained copies of her correspondence with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a criminal psychologist who had worked with the department on several unusual cases. Dr. Martinez had suggested that the intruder might be seeking connection or intimacy through the exploration of other people's private spaces. The careful rearrangement of objects could represent a form of communication, a way of saying, "I was here, I noticed how you live. I wanted to participate in your solitude." Young Susan Walsh, a graduate student who lived in a converted garage apartment behind a house on Elm Street, had been the 6th victim. Her space was small and efficiently organized, every item chosen for both function and the limited storage available. When she returned from a day at the university library, she found that someone had spent considerable time exploring her life through her possessions. Her books had been removed from their shelves and restacked according to size rather than subject. Her clothes had been refolded and arranged by color instead of by type. Her kitchen items had been reorganized so that frequently used items were stored in less convenient locations, while decorative pieces had been moved to prominent positions. The intruder seemed to have spent hours in her small space, not searching for anything in particular, but simply experiencing how someone else had chosen to organize a life. The investigation expanded to include interviews with neighbors, building superintendents, and local business owners. Officer Chun had methodically canvassed each affected neighborhood, building a detailed picture of the daily rhythms and patterns that characterize these quiet residential streets. She had documented the times when buildings were most likely to be empty, the locations where someone could observe comings and goings without being noticed, and the small details of urban life that an outsider might find fascinating. The file contained maps that Officer Chun had hand-drawn, showing the locations of each break-in and the connections between them. The pattern that emerged suggested someone who moved through the city on foot, choosing targets based on opportunity and accessibility rather than following any obvious geographic logic. The affected addresses formed a loose spiral through the central neighborhoods, touching different areas but always returning to streets where solitary people lived quiet lives. As the winter progressed, the break-ins had gradually decreased in frequency before stopping entirely in early March. The final incident had occurred in the apartment of Mr. Thomas Gray, a retired postal worker who lived on the top floor of a 3-story building on Cherry Street. Mr. Gray had returned from his daily walk to find his apartment transformed in the same gentle but unsettling way that had characterized all the previous cases. His collection of model trains, arranged on a large table in his living room, had been completely reconfigured. The tracks had been rearranged to create new routes and connections, the tiny buildings and landscapes repositioned to tell a different story about the miniature world he had spent years creating. The intruder had clearly spent considerable time with the model railroad, understanding its components well enough to create a functional but entirely different configuration. Officer Chun's final report on the case had been filed in late April 1991. She had documented her conclusion that the break-ins had been committed by a single individual who had moved away from the area or simply chosen to stop the activity. No arrests had been made, no suspect had ever been identified, and no similar pattern of crimes had been reported in neighboring jurisdictions. The file also contained an addendum that Officer Chun had added several months later, after she had continued to think about the case during her off-duty hours. She had noted that each victim had reported a strange sense of loss when they discovered that the break-ins had stopped. Despite the violation and unease they had felt, many had admitted that they found themselves wondering about the person who had spent time in their spaces, who had touched their belongings with such careful attention. Mrs. Hoffman had mentioned that she sometimes found herself arranging objects in the new positions that the intruder had chosen. Discovering that some of the changes actually improved the functionality or aesthetic of her living space, Mr. Reeves had kept his desk organized according to the system that the intruder had created, finding that it somehow felt more efficient than his original arrangement. Susan Walsh had left some of her books in the size-based organization that she had found upon returning home, appreciating the visual rhythm it created along her shelves. The investigation had officially closed, but the file remained in Cabinet 347M as a testament to the complexity of human behavior and the sometimes ambiguous nature of crime. Officer Chun had included a final note suggesting that the case represented a form of interaction that fell outside traditional categories of criminal behavior, something that was clearly a violation of privacy and security, but that had also created unexpected moments of connection between strangers. In the quiet of the archive building, where the fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune and the filing cabinets held thousands of similar stories. File 347M0089 rested among its companions. Each file in the drawer represented a moment when the ordinary flow of life had been disrupted by mystery, when the familiar patterns of daily existence had been interrupted by events that resisted easy explanation. The building itself had become a repository of such stories, a place where the strange and unexplained aspects of urban life were carefully documented and preserved. During the day, researchers and police officers would occasionally visit the archives, pulling files and reading through the careful documentation of cases that had been closed, but never quite forgotten. But during the night hours, the files simply existed in their ordered silence, waiting for someone who might someday understand their significance. The security guard continued his rounds, his footsteps echoing softly through corridors, lined with the carefully cataloged mysteries of a city that never truly slept, but only hid its secrets beneath layers of silence. Every report began the same way, with date and time stamped in blue ink. But each one carried the weight of a world that had shifted slightly off its axis. The ritual of police, reporting, had remained unchanged for decades. Officers would sit at their desks in the quiet hours after their shifts, the precinct settling into its nighttime rhythm, and translate the chaos of human experience into the ordered language of official documentation. Each report followed the same format, used the same careful phrasing, and sought to contain the unpredictable nature of crime within the boundaries of standardized forms out in the records room of the 5th Precinct. Housed in a basement space that never saw natural light, thousands of these reports rested in filing cabinets that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The room had the particular smell of aging paper and carbon copies, the metallic scent of filing cabinet hardware, and the faint chemical odor of mimeograph fluid that had been used for decades to reproduce official documents. Officer Patricia Hernandez had filed her final report on a Thursday evening in October 1994. She had worked the evening shift for 6 years and had developed a particular skill for documenting the subtle crimes that occurred in the shadows between more dramatic events. Her reports were known throughout the department for their careful attention to detail and their ability to capture the emotional undercurrents that ran beneath the surface of seemingly simple incidents. Report number 5942-847 concerned a case of vandalism that had occurred over several months in Lincoln Park, a small green space surrounded by residential buildings where elderly residents often sat on benches to watch the changing seasons. Someone had been systematically altering the park's landscape in ways so subtle that most visitors never noticed the changes. But that created a growing sense of unease among those who spent time there regularly. The vandalism had begun in late summer, when Mrs. Rose Chun, an 80-year-old woman who visited the park every morning to feed the pigeons, had noticed that the small memorial plaque dedicated to local veterans had been moved approximately 3 inches to the left on its stone mounting. The plaque had been installed 15 years earlier, and Mrs. Chun had passed it every day since then, developing the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from repeated observation over time. Officer Hernandez had documented Mrs. Chun's statement with the patience that had made her particularly effective at handling cases involving elderly victims. Her report noted that Mrs. Chun had initially dismissed her observation as a trick of memory or perspective, but had returned to the park the following day with a measuring tape to confirm her suspicions. The plaque had indeed been moved, requiring tools and considerable effort to accomplish without damaging either the metal memorial or its stone base. The investigation had expanded when other regular park visitors began reporting similar subtle alterations to familiar landmarks. Mr. James Murphy, a retired teacher who walked through the park twice daily as part of his morning and evening routines, had noticed that several trees along the main path had, been carefully pruned in ways that changed their shapes and the patterns of shade they cast. The pruning had been expertly done, improving the health and appearance of the trees while simultaneously altering the visual rhythm that had characterized the park for years. Officer Hernandez's report included detailed measurements and photographs of the affected trees, documenting not just the fact of their alteration, but the skill with which the work had been performed. She had consulted with the city's parks department to confirm that no authorized maintenance had been scheduled, and had interviewed local landscaping companies to determine whether anyone had been hired privately to perform tree work in the area. The case had grown more complex as additional changes were discovered throughout the fall months. The park's central fountain, a modest stone structure that had provided a focal point for the space since the 1960s, had been subtly modified so that its water flow created different patterns and sounds. Someone with considerable knowledge of hydraulics had adjusted the internal mechanisms to change the fountain's behavior without affecting its basic function or creating any obvious damage. Mrs. Angela Foster, a middle-aged woman who often brought her lunch to eat by the fountain during her work breaks, had been the first to notice the change in the water's sound. Her statement, recorded in Officer Hernandez's careful handwriting, described how the fountain's gentle splash had been part of her daily routine for 3 years, a familiar background rhythm that helped her relax during her brief escapes from her job at a nearby insurance office. The new water pattern created a different kind of music, still pleasant but unfamiliar, and Mrs. Foster found herself listening more consciously to sounds that had previously existed at the edge of her awareness. She had initially assumed that the fountain's mechanisms had simply aged or settled, but closer observation revealed that the changes were too precise and beneficial to be accidental. Someone had clearly spent considerable time studying the fountain's operation and had made deliberate improvements to its performance. Officer Hernandez had documented each reported alteration with the methodical approach that characterized all her investigations. She had created a map of the park showing the location of every change, photographed each modification from multiple angles, and interviewed dozens of regular visitors to build a comprehensive picture of how the space had been transformed over time. The pattern that emerged suggested someone with extensive knowledge of landscaping, hydraulics, and stonework. Someone who visited the park regularly enough to understand its daily rhythms and the habits of its frequent users. The modifications were invariably improvements rather than damage, changes that enhanced the park's functionality and beauty while disrupting the familiar patterns that people had learned to expect. Young Timothy Chun, Mrs. Rose Chun's grandson, who sometimes accompanied her on her morning visits, had reported seeing a man working near the memorial plaque early one morning in September. Timothy's statement, recorded in the simplified language that Officer Hernandez used when interviewing child witnesses, described a middle-aged man with work clothes and a small toolkit, who had been kneeling beside the memorial when Timothy and his grandmother entered the park. The man had looked up when he noticed them approaching, had smiled and waved in a friendly manner, and had gathered his tools and left the park without saying anything. Timothy had assumed that the man was performing authorized maintenance, and had not mentioned the encounter until his grandmother began asking questions about the memorial plaque's changed position several days later. Officer Hernandez had canvassed the neighborhood surrounding the park, showing Timothy's description to residents and business owners in hopes of identifying the man or establishing a pattern of similar activity in other locations. Her report documented visits to hardware stores, gardening centers, and tool rental businesses, seeking anyone who might have sold or rented equipment suitable for the kind of work that had been performed in the park. The investigation had revealed that similar subtle improvements had been made to other public spaces throughout the neighborhood during the same time period. A small community garden 3 blocks from Lincoln Park had been mysteriously weeded and reorganized, with plants rearranged to create better growing conditions and more attractive visual arrangements. The garden's volunteer coordinator had initially assumed that one of the regular gardeners had taken unusual initiative, but inquiries revealed that none of the known volunteers had been responsible for the work. Officer Hernandez's reports on the community garden incidents filled another section of her case file, documenting interviews with each of the garden's regular volunteers and detailed photographs of the improvements that had been made. Someone had clearly spent considerable time studying the garden's layout and the needs of its various plants, creating changes that demonstrated both horticultural knowledge and aesthetic sensitivity. The playground equipment in nearby Riverside Park had also been subject to subtle modifications during the same period. Loose bolts had been tightened, rough surfaces had been sanded smooth, and safety hazards had been corrected, all without any official work orders or authorized maintenance visits. Parents who regularly brought their children to the playground had gradually noticed that the equipment seemed safer and more pleasant to use, but had not initially connected these improvements to any systematic effort. Mrs. Sandra Williams, a young mother who visited Riverside Park several times each week with her 2 small children, had provided a statement describing her growing awareness that someone had been quietly maintaining the playground equipment. She had noticed that the swings moved more smoothly, that the slide surface had been refinished to eliminate rough spots, and that the sandbox had been refilled with clean sand and equipped with a new drainage system that prevented puddles from forming after rainstorms. Officer Hernandez had expanded her investigation to include all public spaces within a 6-block radius of Lincoln Park, documenting a pattern of unauthorized improvements that seemed to be the work of a single individual with diverse technical skills and an unusual commitment to community welfare. Her case file grew to include reports on 14 separate locations where similar modifications had been discovered, each one carefully documented with photographs, measurements, and witness statements. The investigation had reached a turning point in late November when Mr. Henry Kowalski, an elderly man who lived in an apartment overlooking Lincoln Park, had contacted the precinct to report that he had been watching the mysterious maintenance worker through his window for several weeks. Mr. Kowalski suffered from insomnia and often spent his sleepless hours observing the neighborhood from his 4th-floor window, becoming familiar with the area's nighttime rhythms and the few people who moved through the darkness during the early morning hours. His statement, recorded during a lengthy interview in his apartment, described a man who appeared to be in his 40s or early 50s, who arrived at the park before dawn carrying a canvas bag filled with tools and supplies. The man worked quietly and efficiently, spending anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours on various projects before departing as the first regular park visitors began to arrive. Mr. Kowalski had observed this pattern on approximately 12 occasions, noting that the man seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the park's daily schedule and the habits of its frequent users. Officer Hernandez had spent several early mornings positioned where she could observe the park, hoping to encounter the unauthorized maintenance worker and determine his identity and motivations. Her surveillance reports, filed as supplements to the main case file, documented the park's pre-dawn atmosphere and the gradual transition from nighttime emptiness to morning activity as regular visitors arrived for their daily routines. The case had effectively ended in December when the mysterious improvements suddenly stopped occurring. Officer Hernandez had continued her investigation for several more weeks, but no new modifications were reported, and her early morning surveillance sessions failed to produce any contact with the individual who had been responsible for the months of subtle enhancements to the neighborhood's public spaces. Her final report, filed in January 1995, had concluded that the unauthorized maintenance work had been performed by a single individual who had either moved away from the area or had chosen to discontinue the activity for unknown reasons. No charges had ever been filed, since all the reported modifications had improved rather than damaged public property. and no clear legal framework existed for prosecuting someone who had performed unauthorized but beneficial work on city-owned facilities. The case file had included a recommendation that the city's Parks Department study the improvements that had been made and consider incorporating similar modifications into their official maintenance programs. Many of the changes had proven so successful that they had been left in place, becoming permanent features of spaces that continued to serve their communities with enhanced functionality and beauty. Officer Hernandez's report had also noted the philosophical questions raised by the case. The way it challenged assumptions about property ownership, community responsibility, and the relationship between individual initiative and official authority. She had documented the unanimous positive response from community members who had benefited from the improvements, even as they remained puzzled by the mysterious individual who had chosen to work anonymously for their collective benefit. The case had become something of a legend within the 5th Precinct, referenced in training sessions as an example of how criminal investigation sometimes revealed behavior that defied easy categorization. The careful documentation had preserved not just the facts of what had occurred, but the broader questions about community, responsibility, and the ways that individuals sometimes chose to express care for shared spaces and collective welfare. In the basement records room, where Officer Hernandez's final report rested among thousands of similar documents, the case file continued to represent the challenge of translating complex human motivations into the structured language of police documentation. Each page captured a piece of the mystery, but the complete story remained elusive, existing somewhere in the spaces between official observations and the unknowable intentions of a person who had chosen to improve his community while remaining forever anonymous. The reports themselves had become a form of memorial to the careful work of documentation, the way that police officers transformed the chaos and ambiguity of human behavior into ordered records that could be filed, referenced, and preserved. In the quiet of the records room, where the fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune and the filing cabinets held the accumulated stories of a community's encounters with the unexpected. Each report testified to the ongoing effort to understand and document the infinite variety of human action, motivation. The archives occupied the entire 4th floor of the old municipal building, a space that had been designed in the 1940s, when filing systems were simpler and the volume of documentation was measured in hundreds rather than thousands of cases per year. The room stretched the full length of the building, with windows along the eastern wall that let in morning light that gradually shifted across the rows of metal cabinets as the day progressed. Each cabinet bore a small typed label indicating its contents and date range, but these labels told only the most basic story of what lay within. Cabinet Row C contained files from the late 1970s and early 1980s, a period when the city had been smaller and the police force had consisted of officers who knew their neighborhoods, with the intimacy that came from walking the same beats for years at a time. In the 3rd cabinet from the north wall, drawer number C23B held approximately 80 files from the year 1982, each one representing a case that had been opened, investigated, and closed according to the procedures that had governed police work during that era. The files were arranged chronologically, beginning with cases from January and extending through December. A full year of human drama, reduced to manila folders and carbon copy reports. File C23, B0156, concerned a series of incidents that had occurred during the spring of 1982 in the Westbridge neighborhood, a collection of tree-lined streets where middle-class families had lived in modest houses, built during the post-war housing boom. The file's contents told the story of a mystery that had unfolded slowly over several months, drawing the attention of Detective Raymond Walsh, an officer who had worked the Westbridge beat for nearly 15 years. The first report in the file, dated March 15, 1982, described a complaint filed by Mrs. Dorothy Hamilton, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone in a two-story house on Birch Street. Mrs. Hamilton had contacted the police to report that someone had been leaving small gifts on her front porch during the night. Anonymous offerings that appeared with such regularity that she had begun to feel both grateful and unsettled by their presence. Detective Walsh's initial report documented his visit to Mrs. Hamilton's house, a neat colonial structure with a wraparound porch that was furnished with wicker chairs and small tables, where she often sat to read in the afternoons. His notes described the gifts that had been left over the previous 2 weeks: a small potted plant with cheerful, yellow flowers, a library book that Mrs. Hamilton had mentioned wanting to read during a conversation with a neighbor, a package of her favorite tea, and a hand-knitted scarf in colors that perfectly matched her winter coat. The gifts were always placed carefully on the small table beside her front door, positioned where she would discover them when she retrieved her morning newspaper. Each item was accompanied by a brief note written in careful handwriting that simply said, "From Mrs. Hamilton, with appreciation for all you do." The notes were written on plain white paper and showed no distinctive characteristics that might help identify their author. Mrs. Hamilton's statement, recorded in Detective Walsh's methodical handwriting, revealed her complex feelings about the mysterious benefactor. She appreciated the thoughtfulness of the gifts and the obvious care with which they had been chosen, but she was troubled by the idea that someone had been observing her closely enough to know her preferences and daily routines. The accuracy of the gift selection suggested that the giver had been watching her for some time, learning her habits and interests through careful observation. Detective Walsh had expanded his investigation when Mrs. Hamilton mentioned that her neighbor, Mr. Frank Petrosky, had also been receiving similar anonymous gifts. Mr. Petrosky lived in a small bungalow across the street and had been finding items on his porch that demonstrated the same intimate knowledge of his personal interests and needs. A pair of gardening gloves in exactly his size, a book about woodworking techniques that he had mentioned wanting to find, a package of special seeds for the tomato variety he had been trying unsuccessfully to locate at local nurseries. The file contained Detective Walsh's interview notes from his conversation with Mr. Petrosky, a retired machinist who spent most of his time working in his basement workshop or tending his backyard garden. Mr. Petrosky had described the strange mixture of gratitude and unease that the gifts produced, the way they made him feel cared for while simultaneously reminding him that his privacy had been somehow compromised by a well-meaning but unknown observer. As Detective Walsh had continued his investigation, he discovered that the anonymous gift-giving had extended to at least 6 other households in the immediate neighborhood. Each recipient was elderly and lived alone, and each had been receiving carefully chosen items that reflected detailed knowledge of their individual interests, needs, and preferences. Mrs. Agnes Murphy, a widow who lived in a small apartment above the neighborhood bakery, had been finding groceries on her doorstep each week, always items that she needed but had difficulty affording on her limited income. The groceries were expensive varieties of foods that she had mentioned enjoying during more prosperous times in her life, luxury items that she could no longer justify purchasing for herself. Each delivery was accompanied by the same simple note, "For Mrs. Murphy, with appreciation for all you do." Detective Walsh's investigation had revealed that Mrs. Murphy had indeed been quietly helpful to various neighbors over the years, offering small services and assistance that had often gone unrecognized. She had sewn loose buttons for busy mothers, had provided soup for neighbors who were ill, and had watched over packages and mail for people who traveled. Her contributions to the neighborhood's well-being had been subtle and unofficial, the kind of community care that happened without formal acknowledgement or thanks. The pattern had become clear as Detective Walsh interviewed each gift recipient. All were elderly residents who had lived in the neighborhood for many years, and all had histories of quiet helpfulness and community service. Mr. Edward Chun, a retired postal worker, had been receiving books and magazines related to his hobby of model railroading. Always items that were difficult to find and expensive to purchase. Mrs. Helen Rodriguez had been finding art supplies on her porch, materials for the watercolor painting that she had taken up since her retirement but could rarely afford to pursue. Detective Walsh's case file documented his growing fascination with the psychology of the anonymous giver, someone who had clearly been observing the neighborhood with extraordinary attention to detail and who had chosen to express appreciation through carefully targeted generosity. His reports included detailed maps showing the locations of all recipient households and the patterns of gift delivery, as well as interviews with dozens of neighbors who might have witnessed the mysterious benefactor in action. The investigation had intensified when Mrs. Hamilton mentioned that she had begun staying awake at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the person who had been treating her with such unexpected kindness. Her statement described several nights spent sitting in her darkened living room, watching the street through her front window and listening for footsteps on her porch. She had never seen anyone approach her house, but she had noticed that the gifts always appeared on nights when the weather was clear and the moon provided enough natural light for someone to move safely through the neighborhood. Detective Walsh had conducted several nights of surveillance, positioning himself where he could observe the most frequent gift recipients while remaining invisible to anyone moving through the area. His surveillance reports, filed as supplements to the main case file, described the neighborhood's nighttime atmosphere and the gradual realization that the gift giver possessed sophisticated knowledge of police patrol schedules and surveillance techniques. The case had taken an unexpected turn in May when Detective Walsh received a phone call from Mrs. Hamilton, reporting that she had finally seen the anonymous benefactor. She had been unable to sleep due to a spring thunderstorm and had been sitting in her kitchen drinking tea when she noticed a figure moving carefully up her front steps. The person had placed something on her porch table and had turned to leave when a flash of lightning illuminated the scene clearly enough for her to recognize her visitor. Mrs. Hamilton's statement, recorded the following morning, revealed that the mysterious gift giver had been Mr. William Chun, Mr. Edward Chun's adult son, who lived with his elderly father and worked as a night shift janitor at the local hospital. William Chun had been using his intimate knowledge of the neighborhood, gained through years of living there and caring for his aging father, to identify elderly residents who had contributed to the community's well-being and who might benefit from anonymous assistance. Detective Walsh's interview with William Chun, conducted in the Chun family's living room with Mr. Edward Chun present, had revealed the complex motivations behind the months of secret gift-giving. William had explained that his work schedule allowed him to move through the neighborhood during the early morning hours when most residents were asleep, and that his father's stories about the neighborhood's history had taught him to recognize the quiet contributions that various elderly residents had made over the years. The file contained William Chun's statement, recorded in Detective Walsh's careful handwriting, describing his decision to begin the anonymous gift-giving after his father had mentioned feeling sad that so many of the neighborhood's helpful elderly residents seemed lonely and unappreciated. William had used his modest income from his hospital job to purchase gifts that he hoped would brighten their lives and let them know that their contributions to the community had been noticed and valued. No charges had been filed in connection with the case since the gift-giving, while technically constituting trespassing, had been entirely benevolent in nature and had been welcomed by all recipients. Detective Walsh's final report had noted the unusual nature of a criminal investigation that had revealed behavior that was technically illegal but morally admirable, and had recommended that the case be closed without prosecution. The file had included statements from each gift recipient expressing their desire that no legal action be taken against William Chun. And several had asked Detective Walsh to convey their thanks for the months of unexpected kindness they had. Our ECEIV, ED Mrs. Hamilton, had mentioned that the gifts had made her feel connected to her community in a way that she had not experienced since her husband's death several years earlier. The case had concluded with a neighborhood gathering in the Chun's backyard, an informal celebration where the gift recipients had been able to thank William Chun personally, and where the broader community had learned about the quiet acts of service that had been occurring in their midst. Detective Walsh's final report had described the gathering as one of the most positive conclusions to a police investigation that he had experienced in his 15 years of law enforcement work. In the archives, where file C23B0156 rested among its companions in the dim light that filtered through the eastern windows, the case represented the complexity of community relationships and the sometimes ambiguous nature of law enforcement in situations where legal violations and moral imperatives pointed in different directions. The careful documentation had preserved not just the facts of the investigation, but the broader questions about community care, recognition, and the ways that individuals sometimes chose to express gratitude and concern for their neighbors. The file's pages had yellowed slightly over the decades, and the carbon copies had faded to a softer black, but the careful handwriting remained legible, a testament to Detective Walsh's methodical approach to documentation and his understanding that some cases represented more than simple matters of law enforcement. The story contained in those pages continued to exist in the quiet of the archives, waiting for someone who might someday read it and understand something important about the hidden connections that bind communities together. Nearby files in the same drawer contain similar stories from that year, each one representing a moment when the ordinary flow of neighborhood life had been disrupted by mystery, investigation, and eventual understanding. Together, they formed a portrait of a community and a time period, preserved in the careful language of police reports and witness statements that had been filed away to rest in the ordered silence of the archives. The dust that had settled on the cabinet drawers served as a kind of temporal marker, indicating how long it had been since these particular stories had been retrieved and examined. But the stories themselves remained alive within their manila folders, ready to emerge whenever someone might need to understand how a community had once worked through questions of law, morality, and human kindness during the quiet months of a spring that had passed into memory more than 4 decades ago. The courthouse steps had been worn smooth by decades of footsteps, each one carrying the weight of someone's story toward the heavy oak doors that opened onto justice delayed and dreams deferred. The old municipal courthouse stood at the corner of 5th and Main, its limestone facade weathered to a soft gray that seemed to absorb the city's changing light throughout each day. Built in 1923, the building had witnessed thousands of cases, from minor infractions to major felonies, each one leaving its invisible mark in the rooms where testimony had been given. Verdicts had been delivered, and the machinery of justice had turned with its deliberate, measured pace during the daytime hours. The building hummed with activity as lawyers, defendants, witnesses, and court personnel moved through its corridors and chambers. But in the evening, when the last case had been heard and the final gavel had fallen, the courthouse settled into a different kind of existence, one where silence filled the spaces that had been occupied by human drama, and where the building's architecture seemed to hold the memory of all the stories it had contained. The 3rd floor housed Courtroom C, a high-ceilinged chamber with tall windows that faced east toward the residential neighborhoods, where many of the people who appeared before the bench lived their daily lives. The courtroom's oak paneling had been installed when the building was constructed, and it had absorbed decades of testimony, argument, and judgment, developing a patina that spoke of the serious business that had been conducted within these walls. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, an imposing structure of carved oak that elevated the seat of justice above the level where defendants, Lawyers and witnesses conducted their business. Behind the bench, the state seal was mounted on the wall, its bronze surface reflecting the light that filtered through the tall windows during daytime proceedings. The witness chair sat to the right of the bench, positioned so that those who testified could be seen clearly by judge, jury, and the public gallery that filled the rear portion of the room down in the basement of the courthouse, accessible through a narrow staircase that descended from the building's main lobby. Lay the holding cells where defendants waited before their appearances in the courtrooms above. The cells were small concrete chambers, each equipped with a simple bench and designed to accommodate the brief periods of detention that preceded court hearings. The basement had been designed with efficiency rather than comfort in mind. Its fluorescent lighting and institutional green paint, creating an atmosphere that reflected the serious nature of the legal proceedings that brought people to this place. Cell number 3. The middle chamber in a row of 5 had housed thousands of defendants over the decades since the courthouse had opened. The cell's concrete walls bore the subtle marks of all who had waited there. Small scratches and stains that told stories of nervousness, fear, and the strange mixture of emotions that accompanied people as they prepared to face judgment for their actions. During the night hours, when the courthouse stood empty and the building's security system monitored corridors that echoed with the footsteps of no one, these basement cells existed in perfect stillness. The fluorescent lights had been turned off, leaving the chambers in darkness broken only by the small amount of light that filtered down from the lobby level through the stairwell. In this darkness, the cells seemed to hold the accumulated tension of all the defendants who had sat on their simple benches, waiting for their names to be called and their cases to be heard. The courthouse record showed that Cell 3 had been the site of a particular incident in September 1989, when a defendant named Marcus Williams had been waiting to appear before Judge Patricia Morrison for a preliminary hearing on charges of burglary and vandalism. The incident had been documented in the court security files, though it had never resulted in additional charges or formal legal proceedings. Marcus Williams had been arrested for allegedly breaking into several businesses in the downtown commercial district, though the nature of his alleged crimes had been unusual enough to attract the attention of Detective Louise Parker, who had handled the investigation. The businesses that had been entered showed no signs of traditional theft. Cash registers had been left undisturbed. Valuable merchandise had remained untouched, and in several cases expensive equipment had been left in plain sight without being taken. Instead, the intruder had apparently spent time in each business rearranging displays, reorganizing inventory, and in some cases cleaning areas that had been neglected by the regular maintenance staff. At Morrison's bookstore, the alleged intruder had reshelved hundreds of books according to a more logical organizational system and had repaired several damaged volumes using materials that appeared to have been brought from outside. At Chun's Electronics, circuit boards had been sorted and organized, and a complex repair job had been completed on a television that the owner had written off as beyond fixing. Marcus Williams had been discovered sleeping in the back room of Patterson's pharmacy, surrounded by medicine bottles that he had apparently spent the night organizing according to a system that the pharmacist later admitted was more efficient than the one the business had been using. When Officer Rebecca Torres had entered the pharmacy in response to a silent alarm, she had found Williams sleeping peacefully on an improvised bed made from shipping materials, with no evidence that he had attempted to steal drugs, money, or anything else of value. The arrest report, filed by Officer Torres, had documented Williams's cooperative behavior and his apparent confusion about why he was being taken into custody. His statement, recorded at the precinct, revealed that he was homeless and had been seeking warm, dry places to sleep during the increasingly cold September nights. He had chosen businesses that appeared to be cluttered or disorganized, and had spent his time in each location trying to improve their condition as a form of payment for the shelter they provided. Williams had explained that he had learned organizational and repair skills during his years working in various warehouses and retail establishments before becoming homeless following a series of medical bills that had consumed his savings and led to the loss of his apartment. He saw his nighttime activities not as crimes, but as a form of barter, trading his labor and expertise for temporary shelter in spaces that would otherwise have stood empty during the overnight hours. The security report from his time in Cell 3 had been filed by Guard Captain Harold Mason, a 20-year veteran of courthouse security who had developed a reputation for careful observation and detailed documentation of unusual incidents. Captain Mason's report described how Williams had spent his time in the holding cell methodically organizing the few personal possessions that had been allowed to remain with him, creating neat arrangements of his belongings, and even attempting to clean the cell's surfaces with materials improvised from his own clothing. More unusually, Williams had begun talking quietly to himself during his hours in the cell. But his monologue had consisted not of complaints or expressions of anger, but of detailed plans for how various spaces could be better organized and maintained. Captain Mason had documented overhearing Williams discuss strategies for inventory management, customer flow, and workspace efficiency, as if he were consulting on business operations rather than awaiting trial for allegedly burglarizing those same businesses. The incident that had prompted the security report occurred during Williams's second night in custody, when he had somehow managed to organize not just his own cell, but had begun making suggestions to other detainees about how they might better arrange their temporary accommodations. Guard Captain Mason had observed Williams quietly advising a nervous young man in the adjacent cell about how to fold his jacket to create a more comfortable pillow, and had overheard him offering organizational advice to a woman in the holding area who had been struggling to keep track of her personal documents. Williams's behavior had created an unusual atmosphere in the detention area, transforming what was normally a tense and uncomfortable environment into something that resembled a consultant's office where people sought advice about improving their situations. Other detainees had begun requesting cells near Williams, hoping to benefit from his calm presence and practical suggestions, and the usual noise and agitation of the holding area had been replaced by quiet conversations about organization, efficiency, and practical problem solving. Captain Mason's report had noted that Williams's influence on the detention environment had been entirely positive, reducing the stress and anxiety that typically characterized the holding cells, while maintaining the security and order that the facility required. Williams had somehow managed to create a sense of productivity and purpose in a space designed for waiting and reflection, turning detention into an opportunity for practical education and mutual assistance. The case had taken an unexpected turn when several of the business owners who had allegedly been victimized by Williams appeared at his preliminary hearing to speak on his behalf. Morrison, the bookstore owner, had testified that the organizational work done in his store had improved his business operations significantly and had saved him hundreds of dollars in consultant fees that he had been considering paying to address his inventory problems. Chun, the electronics store owner, had brought the television that Williams had allegedly repaired, demonstrating for the court that it was now functioning better than it had when new, and explaining that the repair work would have cost him more than $200 if he had taken it to a professional service center. Patterson, the pharmacist, had testified that the organizational system Williams had implemented had improved his efficiency, so much that he had been able to reduce his working hours while serving more customers. Judge Morrison had found herself presiding over a preliminary hearing where the alleged victims were unanimously requesting that charges be dropped, and where several were offering Williams employment if the court would allow him to avoid incarceration. The court transcript, filed in the case records, showed the judge's careful consideration of a situation that challenged traditional categories of crime and punishment while raising questions about the relationship between property rights, homelessness, and community benefit. The case had been resolved when the business owners formally requested that charges be dismissed, and when Williams accepted an offer to work as a consultant for small businesses in the downtown district, helping them improve their organizational systems and operational efficiency. The arrangement had been formalized through a local nonprofit organization that assisted homeless individuals in finding employment and housing, creating a model that was later replicated in other communities facing similar challenges. Williams had never returned to Cell 3, but his brief time there had become part of the courthouse's institutional memory, referenced in training sessions for security personnel as an example of how individual behavior could transform institutional environments in unexpected ways. Captain Mason's security reports had been preserved in the courthouse archives as documentation of an unusual incident that had challenged assumptions about detention, rehabilitation, and the purposes served by the criminal justice system. In the quiet of the empty courthouse, where the holding cells stood in darkness and the courtrooms waited for another day of testimony and judgment, the story of Marcus Williams in Cell 3 remained part of the building's accumulated history. The concrete walls that had witnessed his organizational efforts and his quiet consultations with fellow detainees continued to exist in the basement's institutional silence, holding the memory of a time when detention had been transformed into something resembling a business improvement seminar. The courthouse building itself had become a repository of such stories, each room and corridor containing the invisible traces of human drama that had played out within its walls. During the daytime hours, when the building filled again with the business of justice, these stories existed beneath the surface of new proceedings and fresh cases, part of the institutional memory that informed how the building's occupants understood their roles in the complex machinery of law and order. The security logs continued to record the building's nighttime quiet, documenting the hours when the courthouse rested between its daily encounters with human conflict and resolution. In this silence, the empty courtrooms and holding cells existed as architectural monuments to the ongoing effort to balance individual needs with community safety, justice with mercy, and the letter of the law with the complex realities of human behavior and social responsibility. The photograph had been taken on a Tuesday afternoon in 1986, but the family gathered around the kitchen table had no way of knowing that their quiet moment would become evidence in a case that wouldn't be opened for another 7 years. The residential neighborhoods that surrounded the downtown district contained thousands of stories woven together by proximity, shared experiences, and the invisible connections that develop when people live their daily lives within sight of each other's windows. Each house on each street held families who moved through their routines, unaware that their actions created patterns that would someday be studied, documented, and preserved in the careful language of police reports and witness statements. The Riverside neighborhood had been built during the 1950s, when young families had moved to the suburbs seeking larger houses, safer streets, and the kind of community atmosphere that was supposed to nurture children and provide stability for adults who had lived through the disruptions of war and economic uncertainty. The houses were modest but well built, each one sitting on a quarter-acre lot that provided enough space for vegetable gardens, swing sets, and the accumulation of possessions that marked the transition from urban apartments to suburban family life. By the late 1980s, many of the neighborhood's original residents had aged into retirement, while their grown children had often moved to other cities for work opportunities, leaving behind houses that held decades of family memories and the quiet presence of elderly couples who had raised their families in rooms that now seemed too large and too empty. The neighborhood had developed a particular atmosphere that characterizes suburban areas where time has passed quietly, where change happens slowly, and where residents have learned to find meaning in the small rituals and routines that structure their daily lives. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez had lived at 847 Maple Street for 34 years. First with her husband Roberto and their 3 children, and then alone after Roberto's death from a heart attack in 1985. Her house was a single-story ranch with a front porch where she sat most evenings, watching the neighborhood's gradual transition from day to night and observing the patterns of activity that mark each season's passage. The police report that eventually documented Mrs. Vasquez's case had been filed by Detective Maria Santos, an officer who had grown up in a similar neighborhood and who understood the complex social dynamics that governed suburban communities where everyone knew their neighbors' business but rarely discussed it directly. Detective Santos had been called to investigate complaints about unusual activity at Mrs. Vasquez's house, reports that had been filed by several neighbors who were concerned about changes in her behavior and the increasing number of visitors who came to her home at all hours of the day and night. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Vasquez had been operating an informal support network for neighborhood residents who needed help with various problems but who were reluctant to seek assistance through official channels. Her house had become a gathering place where elderly residents could discuss their concerns, share resources, and receive practical assistance with tasks that had become difficult for them to manage alone. The complaints had been filed by Mrs. Janet Morrison, who lived across the street at 852 Maple Street, and who had become increasingly worried about the number of cars that parked outside Mrs. Vasquez's house each day. Mrs. Morrison's statement, recorded in Detective Santos's careful handwriting, described her observations of people arriving at all hours, staying for varying lengths of time, and leaving with packages or bags that they hadn't brought with them. Mrs. Morrison had initially assumed that Mrs. Vasquez was running some kind of unlicensed business from her home, possibly selling goods or services without the proper permits or tax documentation. Her concerns had intensified when she noticed that many of the visitors appeared to be elderly residents from other parts of the neighborhood, people who normally didn't interact much with each other, but who seemed to have developed regular patterns of visiting Mrs. Vasquez's house. Detective Santos's investigation had expanded when she received similar reports from Mr. Carl Peterson, who lived at 843 Maple Street and who had noticed that Mrs. Vasquez was receiving unusual numbers of deliveries from grocery stores, pharmacies, and medical supply companies. Mr. Peterson's statement described his growing concern that Mrs. Vasquez might be involved in some kind of fraud or illegal resale operation, particularly when he observed her accepting deliveries addressed to various other people in the neighborhood. The case had taken shape when Detective Santos conducted her first interview with Mrs. Vasquez, a conversation that took place in the living room that had been the center of family life for more than 3 decades. The room was furnished with the accumulated possessions of a long marriage and successful child rearing, photographs and furniture, and decorative objects that told the story of a family that had prospered modestly and lived with obvious affection for each other. Mrs. Vasquez's statement, recorded during that first interview, had revealed the complex network of assistance that she had been coordinating for nearly 2 years, ever since she had realized that many of her elderly neighbors were struggling with tasks and challenges that she could help them address. Through her organizational skills and her network of contacts in the community, the support network had begun informally when Mrs. Vasquez had noticed that her neighbor, Mr. Henry Chun, was having difficulty managing his medication schedule after his wife's death left him responsible for tasks that she had previously handled. Mrs. Vasquez had offered to help him organize his pills and create a system for tracking his daily medication routine. A simple gesture that had revealed her natural talent for solving practical problems and her genuine concern for her neighbors. Word of Mrs. Vasquez's helpfulness had spread through the informal communication networks that connected the neighborhood's elderly residents. And soon she was receiving requests for assistance with various challenges that people faced as they aged in houses that had been designed for younger families and more active lifestyles. She had helped Mrs. Angela Foster organize her finances after her husband's death, had coordinated grocery deliveries for residents who could no longer drive safely, and had arranged for various maintenance and repair, tasks that were beyond the physical capabilities of her elderly neighbors. Detective Santos's investigation had documented the scope of Mrs. Vasquez's activities through interviews with more than 20 neighborhood residents who had received assistance through her informal network. The interviews revealed a comprehensive support system that addressed everything from basic household maintenance to complex healthcare coordination, all organized through Mrs. Vasquez's kitchen table and managed through her careful attention to the individual needs and preferences of each person who sought her help. Mr. Thomas Wright, an 83-year-old widower who lived at 891 Maple Street, had provided a statement describing how Mrs. Vasquez had helped him navigate the complex paperwork required to receive home health care services after a fall had left him temporarily unable to manage his daily routine independently. Mrs. Vasquez had not only helped him complete the necessary forms but had also coordinated with healthcare providers, insurance companies, and family members to ensure that he received appropriate care while maintaining his independence and dignity. Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who lived at 836 Maple Street, had explained how Mrs. Vasquez had organized an informal meal delivery system that ensured elderly residents received nutritious food even when they were unable to shop or cook for themselves. The system involved coordination with local restaurants, grocery stores, and volunteer drivers, all managed through Mrs. Vasquez's personal relationships and her reputation for reliability and discretion. The investigation had revealed that Mrs. Vasquez was using her own financial resources to supplement the support network when necessary, purchasing groceries for neighbors who couldn't afford them, paying for repairs that were beyond their budgets, and covering transportation costs for medical appointments that might otherwise have been missed. Her careful record-keeping showed that she had spent thousands of dollars of her own modest savings to ensure that her neighbors received the assistance they needed. Detective Santos's case file had grown to include detailed documentation of the network's operations, including schedules of regular activities, lists of participating residents and volunteers, and financial records showing the flow of resources through Mrs. Vasquez's informal but highly organized system. The investigation had revealed that what appeared to outside observers to be suspicious or potentially illegal activity was actually a sophisticated community support network that was addressing genuine needs through voluntary cooperation and mutual assistance. The case had reached a turning point when Detective Santos realized that her investigation was documenting not criminal activity, but an exemplary model of community organization that was achieving results that formal social service agencies had been unable to accomplish. Mrs. Vasquez had created a system that respected the independence and privacy of elderly residents while providing them with practical assistance that allowed them to continue living in their own homes with dignity and security. The final phase of the investigation had involved meetings with city social service administrators, neighborhood association representatives, and community health organizations, all of whom expressed interest in learning from Mrs. Vasquez's approach and potentially providing official support for her activities. Detective Santos's final report had recommended that the case be closed without charges and that Mrs. Vasquez's network be recognized as a community resource worthy of official acknowledgement and support. The resolution had included the establishment of formal partnerships between Mrs. Vasquez's network, and several city agencies, providing her with access to additional resources and official backing for her activities, while preserving the informal, personal character that had made her approach so effective. The network had been incorporated as a non-profit organization, allowing it to receive grants and donations while maintaining the neighborhood-based, relationship-centered approach that had been the source of its success. Mrs. Vasquez's house at 847 Maple Street had continued to serve as the center of the support network, but with the addition of official recognition and resource support that allowed the system to expand and serve additional neighborhoods throughout the city. Her kitchen table remained the place where individual problems were discussed and solutions were developed. But those conversations now took place within a framework of official support and community recognition. Detective Santos's case file had become part of the police department's training materials, used to illustrate how thorough investigation could reveal community resources and positive activities that might initially appear suspicious to outside observers. The case had also been referenced in academic studies of informal community organization and in policy discussions about how official agencies could better support grassroots efforts to address social challenges. In the quiet of the neighborhood, where Mrs. Vasquez continued to live and work in her house on Maple Street, the network had become a permanent part of the community's social infrastructure. The houses along the tree-lined streets contained residents who knew that assistance was available when they needed it, and that their neighborhood had developed its own system for ensuring that aging and solitude didn't have to mean isolation or neglect. The photograph that had been taken in Mrs. Vasquez's kitchen in 1986, showing her family gathered around the table where she would later coordinate her community support network, had become a symbol of how individual initiative and community concern could address social challenges that seemed too large for any single person to tackle. The image captured not just a family moment, but the beginning of a story about how one person's caring attention to her neighbor's needs had transformed an entire community's approach to aging. Independence and mutual support. The night shift began at 11. When the day's chaos settled into the steady rhythm of paperwork, and the precinct transformed into a place where time moved differently, marked by the soft clicking of typewriter keys and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. The third precinct building had been constructed in 1967, designed with the utilitarian efficiency that characterized public buildings of that era. Its brick exterior and institutional windows gave no hint of the human dramas that played out within its walls 24 hours a day. But during the night hours, when the building's population dwindled to a skeleton crew of officers, dispatchers, and desk personnel, the space took on a different character entirely. Officer Jennifer Martinez had worked the midnight shift for 4 years, long enough to understand the particular rhythm that governed the precinct during the hours when most of the city slept. The night shift attracted a certain type of officer, people who appreciated the relative quiet and the opportunity to focus on the detailed work that often got rushed during the busier daytime hours. The pace was steadier but less predictable, punctuated by emergency calls that could transform a quiet evening into hours of intense activity, followed by long periods of documentation and follow-up work. The main desk area occupied the center of the precinct's ground floor, a large space furnished with metal desks that had been purchased sometime in the 1970s and had acquired the particular patina that came from decades of constant use. Each desk bore the marks of the officers who had worked there over the years, small scratches and stains, and the accumulated wear patterns that told stories of countless reports written, interviews conducted, and phone calls made during the long hours when the rest of the city was asleep. During the night shift, the desk area became the center of a quieter but more contemplative kind of police work. Officers would sit at their assigned desks, working through the paperwork that had accumulated during their patrols, translating the events of the night into the careful language of official reports. The sound of typing provided a constant background rhythm, occasionally punctuated by the ring of telephones or the crackle of radio communications from patrol units still active on the streets. Officer Martinez's desk was positioned near the large windows that faced east toward the residential neighborhoods, where she had grown up and where many of the people she encountered during her patrols lived their daily lives. During the late-night hours, she could see the scattered lights of houses where insomniacs watched television, night shift workers prepared for their jobs, and parents tended to sick children or restless babies. The view provided a constant reminder of the community that the precinct served, the thousands of people whose lives intersected with law enforcement in ways both routine and extraordinary. Asterisk. The case files that accumulated on Officer Martinez's desk during her 4 years of night shift work told a different story than the dramatic crimes that captured public attention during news broadcasts and newspaper headlines. The night shift dealt with the quieter emergencies, the domestic disputes that simmered for hours before boiling over, the mental health crises that developed in the isolation of solitary apartments, and the petty crimes that occurred when people thought the darkness would provide cover for their activities. One particular case that had occupied much of Officer Martinez's attention during the winter of 1993 involved a series of incidents that had been reported by night shift workers throughout the downtown commercial district. The case had begun with reports from security guards, cleaning crews, and late-night restaurant employees who had noticed unusual activity in the alleyways and loading areas behind the buildings where they worked. The reports described a person or persons who had been systematically cleaning and organizing the service areas behind downtown businesses, removing trash that had accumulated beyond the regular collection schedule, organizing recycling materials according to proper sorting procedures, and performing minor maintenance tasks on dumpsters, loading docks, and utility areas that were normally visible only to the workers who used them. Officer Martinez's investigation had begun with interviews conducted during the early morning hours, when night shift workers were ending their duties and day shift personnel were arriving for work. She had spoken with janitors, security guards, restaurant workers, and delivery personnel, building a picture of the mysterious activity through the observations of people who worked when most of the city was asleep and who had developed an intimate familiarity with the nighttime rhythms of the commercial district. Carlos Mendoza, who worked as a security guard for a downtown office building, had provided the most detailed account of the unusual activity. His statement, recorded in Officer Martinez's careful handwriting, described his observations of a middle-aged woman who appeared in the alley behind his building approximately 3 times per week, always arriving after midnight and working quietly until just before dawn. The woman brought her own supplies and equipment, including heavy-duty trash bags, cleaning materials, and simple tools for minor repairs. She worked methodically and efficiently, focusing on tasks that improved the functionality and appearance of areas that were normally neglected because they were not visible to the general public. She had repaired a broken fence that had been allowing debris to blow into the neighboring apartment building's yard, had organized a chaotic recycling area into a system that made it easier for collection crews to do their work efficiently, and had cleaned graffiti from walls using techniques that were more effective than the methods employed by the building's regular maintenance crew. Mendoza's observations had been supplemented by reports from other night shift workers who had encountered the mysterious volunteer in different locations throughout the downtown area. Maria Santos, who worked as a cleaner for several downtown restaurants, had described finding that the alley behind her workplaces had been transformed overnight, with dumpster areas organized and cleaned, loading zones swept and organized, and minor safety hazards corrected through simple but effective repairs. Officer Martinez's case file had grown to include reports from more than 15 different night shift workers, each describing similar encounters with the volunteer who had been improving the hidden infrastructure of the downtown commercial district. The pattern that emerged suggested someone with considerable knowledge of urban maintenance, waste management, and the practical challenges faced by businesses that operated in older buildings with limited space for service operations. The investigation had intensified when Officer Martinez realized that the volunteers' activities were having a measurable, positive impact on the downtown area's functionality and appearance. Business owners who had been contacted during the day shift reported that their operating costs had decreased due to more efficient waste management, that their relationships with neighboring businesses had improved due to better maintenance of shared alley spaces, and that their employees felt safer working in areas that had been better organized and maintained. The case had taken an unexpected turn when Officer Martinez encountered the volunteer directly during a routine patrol of the downtown area at approximately 2:30 in the morning. She had been investigating a burglar alarm that had turned out to be a false alarm when she noticed someone working in the alley behind the building, moving quietly but purposefully through tasks that clearly required considerable physical effort and specialized knowledge. The encounter, documented in Officer Martinez's incident report, had revealed that the mysterious volunteer was Mrs. Catherine Walsh, a retired city employee who had worked for the municipal sanitation department for 28 years before taking early retirement. Due to budget cuts that had eliminated her position, Mrs. Walsh had been using her expertise and her familiarity with the city's infrastructure to address maintenance problems that she encountered during her nightly walks through the downtown area. Mrs. Walsh's statement, recorded during an interview at the precinct later that morning, had revealed the complex motivations behind her volunteer work. She explained that her forced retirement had left her feeling disconnected from work that had provided meaning and purpose for nearly 3 decades, and that her insomnia had led her to take long walks through the city during the overnight hours when she couldn't sleep. Her walks had gradually evolved from simple exercise into informal inspections of the areas she encountered, and her professional training had made her acutely aware of maintenance problems and safety hazards that were invisible to people without her specialized knowledge. She had begun carrying basic supplies and tools during her walks, initially intending only to address minor problems that she encountered, but had found that her efforts were making a meaningful difference in the functionality and safety of the downtown commercial district. The case had concluded when Officer Martinez arranged a meeting between Mrs. Walsh and several downtown business owners, as well as representatives from the city's current sanitation and maintenance departments. The meeting had resulted in an offer for Mrs. Walsh to work as a consultant for the business association, providing her expertise on a part-time basis, while maintaining the flexibility to continue her volunteer work in areas that fell outside the scope of official municipal services. The arrangement had formalized Mrs. Walsh's contributions while preserving the personal satisfaction she derived from improving her community through direct, hands-on work. Her activities had expanded to include training programs for business owners and employees, helping them develop more efficient systems for waste management, recycling, and maintenance of their service areas. Officer Martinez's case file had become a model for how night shift investigations could reveal community resources and positive activities that might not be apparent during regular daytime operations. The case had been referenced in discussions about community policing strategies and had contributed to the development of programs that connected retired municipal employees with volunteer opportunities that utilized their professional expertise. In the quiet of the precinct during subsequent night shifts, Officer Martinez had continued to encounter cases that revealed the complex ways that community members contributed to public welfare through unofficial channels. Her desk became a repository for files documenting volunteer activities, informal support networks, and individual initiatives that addressed community needs through direct action rather than official programs. The rhythm of the night shift had provided Officer Martinez with opportunities to observe and document aspects of community life that were less visible during the busier daytime hours. The quiet periods between emergency calls allowed for the kind of detailed investigation and careful documentation that could reveal the positive activities that often occurred alongside the criminal behavior that dominated public perceptions of law enforcement work. The precinct building itself had become a repository of these quieter stories, each night shift adding new documentation to the growing collection of cases that revealed community strengths rather than criminal activity. The files accumulated in desk drawers and filing cabinets, waiting for someone who might need to understand how individual initiative and community concern could address problems that seemed beyond the scope of official solutions. During the deep hours of the night, when the precinct settled into its quietest rhythm and the fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune over officers working at their desks, the building held all these stories in its institutional silence. Each report documented a moment when the ordinary flow of community life had been enhanced by someone's decision to contribute their skills and energy to the common welfare, transforming the hidden infrastructure of the city through patient, methodical work that occurred while most people slept. The photographs yellowed slowly, like autumn leaves pressed between the pages of forgotten books, each image holding light from decades past when the world looked different but felt remarkably the same. In the evidence room of the Central Police Station, housed in a climate-controlled basement space designed to preserve materials indefinitely, thousands of photographs rested in carefully labeled envelopes and archival boxes. Each image had been taken as documentation of a crime scene, witness interview, or investigation procedure. But over the years, they had accumulated into an unintentional museum of the city's changing face and the evolving nature of the communities that law enforcement served. The evidence room's fluorescent lights cast an even, institutional glow over row after row of metal shelving that extended from floor to ceiling, each shelf bearing boxes that contained the physical remnants of cases both solved and unsolved. The photographs occupied a special section where temperature and humidity were carefully controlled to prevent the chemical degradation that had affected many older police photographs before proper preservation techniques had been implemented. Detective Robert Kim had been assigned to review and digitize older photographic evidence as part of a department-wide modernization initiative, a project that required him to spend hours each week examining images that had been taken by officers who had long since retired, documenting crimes that had occurred in neighborhoods that no longer existed, showing people who had aged beyond recognition or had passed away during the decades since the photographs were taken. Asterisk. The work had a meditative quality that Detective Kim had not expected when he first received the assignment. Each photograph required careful examination to determine its relevance to ongoing cases or its potential historical value. And the process of studying images from different eras had given him an unusual perspective on how the city had changed while remaining fundamentally constant in the types of human drama that brought people into contact with the criminal justice system. Box E1978C contained approximately 200 photographs from cases that had been investigated during the late 1970s, when the city had been smaller and many of the neighborhoods that were now commercial or residential districts had been industrial areas filled with warehouses, factories, and the modest houses where working families had lived within walking distance of their jobs. Photographs in Box E1978C documented a case that had been investigated by Detective Patricia Chun, an officer who had spent her entire career working in the neighborhoods where she had grown up and who had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the families, businesses, and social dynamics that characterized her patrol area. The case had involved reports of vandalism at the Riverside Community Center, a building that had served the neighborhood since the 1940s and that provided meeting space, recreational activities, and social services for residents who had limited access to such resources elsewhere in the city. The first photograph in the file showed the community center's main hall as it had appeared in October 1978. A large room with wooden floors that had been polished by decades of dances, meetings, and community gatherings. The image captured the aftermath of what appeared to be deliberate damage. Tables and chairs had been overturned, decorations had been torn from the walls, and equipment had been scattered across the floor in patterns that suggested anger rather than simple mischief. Asterisk Detective Chun's investigation photographs had documented the scene with the methodical attention to detail that characterized her approach to all cases. She had photographed the damaged areas from multiple angles, capturing not just the obvious destruction, but the subtle details that might provide clues about the perpetrator's identity and motivations. The images showed footprint patterns in the dust that had been disturbed, fingerprint smudges on surfaces that had been touched during the vandalism, and the particular ways that various objects had been moved or damaged. The community center had been preparing for its annual harvest festival when the vandalism occurred, and the photographs showed the remains of decorations that volunteers had spent weeks creating. Paper leaves and autumn colors had been scattered across the floor. Handmade signs advertising the festival's activities had been torn and crumpled, and tables that had been set up to display community members' crafts and baked goods had been overturned, spilling their contents across the polished wooden floor. Detective Kim had found the photographs particularly affecting because they captured not just the physical damage but the emotional impact of the vandalism on a community that had invested considerable time and effort in preparing for an event that was clearly important to their collective life. The images showed the disruption of something that had been created through cooperation and shared enthusiasm, transformed in a single night into a scene of destruction and disappointment. The investigation photographs had been supplemented by images that Detective Chen had taken during her interviews with community members who had been involved in preparing for the Harvest Festival. These photographs showed the faces of people as they described their reactions to discovering the vandalism, capturing expressions of sadness, anger, and determination that revealed how deeply the attack on their community center had affected them. Mrs. Rose Martinez, who had served as the festival's volunteer coordinator, had been photographed sitting at her kitchen table surrounded by the materials she had been using to create decorations for the event. The image showed her holding pieces of torn paper that had been part of a banner she had spent hours painting, her expression reflecting the particular kind of hurt that comes from having creative work destroyed by people who couldn't understand or appreciate the care that had gone into its creation. Mr. James Washington, who had been the community center's volunteer janitor for 15 years, had been photographed standing in the main hall during the cleanup process, his posture and expression conveying the weight of responsibility he felt for the building's security and his distress at the damage that had occurred despite his careful attention to locking procedures and maintenance routines. The investigation had expanded when Detective Chun discovered that similar acts of vandalism had occurred at several other community facilities throughout the neighborhood during the same time period. The photographs documenting these related incidents showed a pattern of destruction that seemed designed to disrupt community activities rather than to steal property or achieve any obvious material benefit. The neighborhood's small library branch had been vandalized in a way that specifically targeted displays of local history and community announcements, while the recreational equipment at the local playground had been damaged in ways that made it unusable, but that didn't suggest any attempt to remove valuable materials. The photographs showed that the vandalism was focused on disrupting the infrastructure of community life rather than on acquiring anything of monetary value. Detective Chun's case file had grown to include interviews with dozens of community members, each conversation revealing another layer of the social dynamics that governed the neighborhood and the importance of the institutions that had been targeted by the vandalism. The photographs taken during these interviews had captured not just witness statements, but the broader context of a community that was struggling to maintain its cohesion in the face of economic pressures and demographic changes that were transforming the area's character. The breakthrough in the case had come when Detective Chen interviewed Mrs. Dorothy Kim, an elderly woman who lived in an apartment that overlooked the community center's parking lot. Mrs. Kim had provided a detailed account of suspicious activity she had observed during the nights preceding the vandalism, and her statement had led to the identification of a group of teenagers who had been responsible for the attacks on community facilities. The photographs taken during the arrests had shown young people who seemed surprised by the seriousness with which their actions were being treated. Teenagers who appeared to have viewed their nighttime activities as pranks rather than as attacks on institutions that were vital to their neighbors' quality of life. The images captured the moment when the vandals were confronted with the actual impact of their behavior on people who had been working to improve their community through volunteer efforts and mutual support. The resolution of the case had involved a restorative justice process that brought the teenage vandals together with the community members who had been affected by their actions. Detective Chun had photographed several of these meetings, capturing images that showed the gradual development of understanding between the young people and the adults whose work they had disrupted. The most significant photograph in the case file had been taken during the rescheduled Harvest Festival, which had taken place several weeks after the original date to allow time for cleanup and preparation of new decorations. The image showed the community center's main hall filled with neighbors who had come together not just to celebrate the autumn season but to demonstrate their commitment to maintaining the institutions that supported their collective life. The photograph captured the teenagers who had committed the vandalism, working alongside the community members they had initially disrupted, helping to set up tables, hang decorations, and serve food to festival attendees. The image documented a transformation that had occurred through patient dialogue and the kind of community-based accountability that was possible in neighborhoods where people knew each other and shared responsibility for maintaining their common spaces. Detective Chun's final report on the case had noted that the vandalism had ultimately strengthened the community's resolve to protect and support their shared institutions, leading to increased volunteer participation in community center activities and the establishment of neighborhood watch programs that provided better security for public facilities. The photographs documenting the festival showed a community that had been tested by adversity but had emerged with stronger connections and a deeper appreciation for the work required to maintain the institutions that supported their collective welfare. Detective Kim had found that many of the older photograph collections contained similar stories, cases where initial criminal activity had revealed community strengths and had led to positive changes that persisted long after the original crimes had been resolved. The images served as documentation not just of law enforcement activities, but of the resilience and creativity that communities demonstrated when faced with challenges to their shared institutions and values. In the climate-controlled environment of the evidence room, where the photographs rested in their archival boxes and preservation envelopes, these images continued to document moments when communities had been tested and had found ways to respond that strengthened, rather than diminished, their capacity for collective action. The photographs had become historical documents that captured not just individual crimes, but the broader social processes through which neighborhoods addressed conflicts and maintained the institutions that supported community life. The digitization project had revealed that many cases from earlier decades had concluded with community-based solutions that were less common in contemporary law enforcement practice. Approaches that emphasized restoration and community healing rather than purely punitive responses to criminal behavior. The photographs provided visual documentation of these alternative approaches and their effectiveness in addressing the root causes of crime while maintaining community cohesion. Detective Kim's work had become a form of archaeological exploration, uncovering layers of community history that were preserved in the careful documentation that previous generations of officers had created through their photographic records. Each image contained information not just about specific crimes, but about the social contexts in which those crimes had occurred and the community resources that had been mobilized to address them. The city had become its own archive, with every street corner and bridge holding memories that only revealed themselves to those who knew how to read the subtle language of accumulated time. Captain Sarah Chun had worked in law enforcement for 28 years, long enough to witness how neighborhoods transformed while retaining the invisible traces of their previous incarnations. She had walked beats that no longer existed, had responded to calls at addresses that had been demolished and rebuilt, and had investigated crimes in locations that bore no resemblance to their current appearances, but that somehow still carried the essence of events that had occurred there decades earlier. Her office on the 5th floor of the central station overlooked downtown streets that had been redesigned multiple times during her career, each renovation erasing some physical traces of the past while inadvertently preserving others in unexpected ways. The view from her window had taught her to see the city as a palimpsest, a document that had been written and rewritten countless times, but that still revealed glimpses of its earlier text to anyone who learned how to look beneath the surface. The case that had occupied much of Captain Chun's attention during her final year before retirement involved a series of incidents that seemed to be connected to locations throughout the city where significant crimes had occurred in previous decades. The pattern had emerged slowly, noticed first by patrol officers who began reporting unusual activities at sites that had been the scenes of major investigations during the 1970s and 1980s. The activities were subtle and apparently harmless. Flowers left at locations where victims had been found, small memorials created at sites where important arrests had been made, and quiet gatherings of people who seemed to be paying respect to places that held significance in the city's criminal history. The incidents had been reported as suspicious activities, but investigation had revealed that they represented a form of unofficial commemoration that was being organized by people who understood the historical importance of locations that appeared ordinary to casual observers. Officer Michael Rodriguez had filed the first report in what would become an extensive case file, documenting his observations of fresh flowers that appeared regularly at the corner of 5th and Main Streets, a busy intersection in the commercial district where morning commuters and shoppers passed without noticing the small bouquet that was replaced weekly by an unknown person who seemed to understand that this location had special significance. Captain Chun's review of historical records had revealed that the corner of 5th and Main had been the site where Detective Margaret Santos had apprehended the suspect in the 1983 Riverside Park case, an arrest that had ended a 6-month investigation into a series of attacks on elderly residents. The arrest had been the culmination of Detective Santos's careful work building trust with community members who had been afraid to provide information about crimes in their neighborhood, and the location had acquired symbolic importance as a place where police work and community cooperation had combined to address a serious threat to public safety. The investigation had expanded when similar flower memorials were discovered at other locations throughout the city, each one marking a site that had played an important role in a significant criminal case from previous decades. The memorials were always small and tasteful, designed to honor the location's historical importance without creating disruptions or drawing unwanted attention from people who didn't understand their significance. Detective Lisa Park had been assigned to investigate the memorial activities, and her case file documented a network of retired police officers, crime victims, family members, and community activists who had been quietly maintaining these unofficial monuments to important moments in the city's law enforcement history. The network had developed organically over several years, as people who had been connected to significant cases had begun meeting informally to share memories and ensure that important locations were properly commemorated. The memorial at the intersection of Elm and 3rd Streets marked the place where Officer Robert Kim had been shot while responding to a domestic violence call in 1979. Officer Kim had survived the shooting and had returned to duty after a lengthy recovery, but the location had remained significant to him and to the partner who had been with him that night. The weekly flowers at that location were placed by Mrs. Dorothy Kim, Officer Kim's widow, who had continued the practice after her husband's death in 2001 as a way of ensuring that his service and sacrifice were remembered. Captain Chun's investigation had revealed that the memorial network included more than 40 active participants who maintained commemorative sites at locations throughout the city. Each site had been chosen because it represented a moment when law enforcement had made a meaningful difference in community safety or had demonstrated the importance of cooperation between police officers and the residents they served. The memorial at the entrance to Riverside Park honored the location where Detective Carlos Mendoza had conducted the community meeting that led to the formation of the neighborhood watch program that had successfully reduced crime in the area during the late 1980s. The site was maintained by Mrs. Angela Foster, who had been one of the original neighborhood watch volunteers and who credited the program with making it possible for her to raise her children in safety in a neighborhood that had previously been troubled by frequent criminal activity. Detective Park's interviews with Memorial Network participants had revealed the deep connections that many community members felt to specific locations where they had experienced significant interactions with law enforcement. The memorials served not just as historical markers but as focal points for ongoing reflection about the role of police work in community life and the importance of maintaining the relationships that made effective law enforcement possible. The investigation had uncovered a rich oral history tradition that had developed within the Memorial Network, with participants sharing stories about the cases and officers that were commemorated at each site. Mrs. Rose Martinez, who maintained the memorial at the corner of Oak and 2nd Streets, had collected detailed accounts from witnesses to the 1985 arrest that had taken place at that location, preserving testimony that had never been formally recorded, but that provided valuable insight into how the community had experienced that important law enforcement action. The memorial activities had evolved to include annual gatherings, where network participants met at significant locations to share stories, honor deceased officers and victims, and discuss how the lessons learned from historical cases could be applied to contemporary community safety challenges. These gatherings had become informal educational events, where retired officers shared their experiences with younger community members, and where the connection between past and present law enforcement activities was explicitly acknowledged and celebrated. Captain Chun had attended several of these memorial gatherings, and her reports documented the unique perspective on police work that emerged from the combination of professional experience and community memory. The participants had developed a sophisticated understanding of how specific locations had served as turning points in the city's relationship with crime and justice, and their discussions revealed insights about effective law enforcement that complemented but extended beyond official training and policy documents. The case had taken an unexpected turn when Captain Chen realized that the Memorial Network was providing valuable intelligence about current criminal activities, as participants who spent time at significant locations often noticed patterns of behavior that might not be apparent to officers who were less familiar with the historical context of specific sites. Several ongoing investigations had benefited from observations provided by Memorial Network members who understood what normal activity looked like at locations they visited regularly. Mr. Henry Washington, who maintained the memorial at the entrance to Lincoln Park, had provided information that helped solve a series of vandalism incidents that had been targeting community facilities in the area. His regular visits to place flowers at the site where Officer Patricia Hernandez had conducted her successful investigation into similar vandalism in 1994 had made him unusually observant of activities in the park, and his reports had provided crucial details about the timing and methods used by the current vandals. The resolution of Captain Chen's investigation had involved the formalization of the Memorial Network as an official community partnership with the police department, providing participants with training in observation and reporting techniques, while preserving the informal, community-based character that had made their activities so effective. The partnership had created new channels for communication between law enforcement and community members, while honoring the historical connections that had brought the network together. The memorial sites had been officially recognized as important historical locations, with small plaques installed at each site, providing basic information about the law enforcement activities that had occurred there. The plaques served as educational tools for community members who were unaware of their neighborhood's criminal justice history, while providing formal acknowledgement of the volunteer efforts that had been preserving these memories through individual initiative. Captain Chun's final report on the Memorial Network case had noted that the investigation had revealed community resources and historical knowledge that were not captured in official police records, but that provided valuable context for understanding how law enforcement relationships had developed in different neighborhoods over time. The Memorial Network had become a bridge between the institutional memory of the police department and the lived experience of community members who had been affected by significant criminal cases. In her retirement, Captain Chun had continued to visit the memorial sites during her walks through the city, observing how they served as quiet reminders of the complex history that connected law enforcement with community life. The flowers and small monuments had become part of the urban landscape, noticed by some residents and ignored by others, but serving as constant testimony to the idea that important events deserved to be remembered, and that public spaces could hold private meanings that enriched community life. The streets themselves had become repositories of these layered memories, carrying the traces of crime solved and unsolved, of officers who had served with distinction and community members who had contributed to public safety through their cooperation and vigilance. The Memorial Network had made visible connections that had always existed, but that were rarely acknowledged, creating a map of significance that overlay the city's official geography with patterns of meaning that reflected the accumulated experience of people who had lived through the challenges and victories that shaped community safety over time. The city continued to change and develop, with new buildings replacing old ones and new residents moving into neighborhoods where they gradually learned the rhythms and patterns that characterized their adopted communities. But the memorial sites persisted, maintained by people who understood that memory was an active practice that required ongoing attention and care, and that the past remained relevant to contemporary life in ways that were both subtle and profound. Archivist Margaret Walsh had worked in the police records department for 35 years, longer than anyone else in the building's institutional memory. She had arrived as a young woman in 1967, when the filing systems were simpler and the volume of documentation was measured in hundreds rather than thousands of cases per year. Over the decades, she had witnessed the transformation of police work from a largely analog profession to one increasingly dependent on digital technology. But her role had remained constant, preserving the physical records that documented the intersection between law enforcement and community life. Her office occupied a corner of the archive building's 4th floor, positioned where she could observe both the rows of filing cabinets that contained the city's criminal justice history and the windows that looked out over the neighborhoods where that history had unfolded. The view provided a daily reminder of the connection between the paperwork that filled the archive and the living community that continued to generate new stories, new investigations, and new files that would eventually join the thousands already resting in their manila folders and storage boxes. The process of closing a case file involved more than simply adding a final report and moving the folder to long-term storage. Each file represented months or years of investigation, documentation, and follow-up work, and the act of formally closing a case required careful review to ensure that all relevant materials had been properly preserved and that the file contained a complete record of the law enforcement activities that had been conducted. Archivist Walsh had developed her own ritual for case closures, a systematic review process that served both practical and symbolic purposes. She would examine each document in the file, checking for completeness and proper organization, and would then create a summary sheet that identified the case's key elements and its final resolution. The summary sheet would be attached to the front of the file, providing future researchers with a quick overview of the case's contents and significance, the case that would be her final file. Closure before retirement had arrived on her desk in late October 2002, a thick folder that documented an investigation spanning nearly 2 years and involving dozens of interviews, surveillance reports, and evidence analyses. The case had been handled by Detective Thomas Rodriguez, an officer whose meticulous documentation and thorough investigation techniques had made his files particularly valuable resources for training purposes and historical research. Case file 023847 concerned a series of incidents that had occurred throughout the city during 2000 and 2001. Events that had initially appeared unrelated, but that investigation had revealed to be part of a coordinated effort to improve community safety. Through unofficial channels, the case had begun with reports of mysterious repairs to playground equipment, improvements to lighting in poorly illuminated areas, and the installation of informal safety measures in locations where residents had expressed concerns about crime and personal security. Detective Rodriguez's initial reports had documented the scope of the unofficial safety improvements, which had occurred in more than 30 different locations across 12 distinct neighborhoods. The improvements were always professionally executed, using quality materials and proper installation techniques, but they were completed without official permits or authorization from city agencies responsible for public infrastructure maintenance. The investigation had revealed that the safety improvements were being coordinated by a network of retired construction workers, electricians, and other skilled tradespeople who had organized themselves into an informal community service organization. The network included more than 60 volunteers who donated their time, expertise, and materials to address safety concerns that had been reported to city agencies, but that had not been addressed due to budget constraints or bureaucratic delays. The volunteer network had been organized by Mr. Frank Patterson, a retired electrical contractor who had been concerned about his granddaughter's safety while walking to school through a neighborhood where several streetlights had been broken for months without being repaired. Rather than wait for official action, Patterson had repaired the lights himself, using his own materials and equipment to restore illumination to areas where children and elderly residents had been avoiding nighttime activities due to safety concerns. Patterson's initial efforts had attracted the attention of other retired tradespeople who shared his frustration with the gap between community safety needs and official response capabilities. The network had developed organically with volunteers, identifying problems through their own observations and through reports from community members who had learned that the group was willing and able to address infrastructure problems that fell outside the scope of routine municipal maintenance. Detective Rodriguez's case file contained detailed documentation of the network's activities, including photographs of completed safety improvements, interviews with community members who had benefited from the volunteer work, and technical assessments of the quality and safety of the installations that had been completed. The investigation had revealed that the volunteer work was consistently professional in quality and had resulted in measurable improvements in community safety and resident satisfaction. The case had presented unique challenges for law enforcement, as the volunteer activities were technically violations of city ordinances regarding unauthorized work on public property, but they were universally beneficial in their effects and were strongly supported by the communities where they had been implemented. Detective Rodriguez had worked closely with city attorneys and municipal officials to develop a response that recognized both the legal issues raised by the unauthorized work and the and positive impact it had achieved. The resolution had involved the creation of formal partnerships between the volunteer network and appropriate city agencies, providing the group with official authorization to continue their safety improvement work while ensuring that their activities were properly coordinated with municipal planning and maintenance operations. The partnership had included training programs that helped volunteers understand relevant regulations and safety standards, while preserving the flexibility and responsiveness that had made their unofficial efforts so effective. Archivist Walsh's review of the case file had revealed the complex documentation that Detective Rodriguez had compiled to support the legal and administrative processes that had formalized the volunteer safety network. The file contained correspondence with multiple city agencies, legal analyses of the regulatory issues raised by the unauthorized improvements, and detailed assessments of the community impact achieved through the volunteer activities. The case had concluded with the establishment of the Community Safety Partnership Program, a permanent municipal initiative that provided structure and support for volunteer efforts to address infrastructure problems and safety concerns. The program had served as a model for similar initiatives in other cities and had been recognized by professional organizations as an innovative approach to community police cooperation. The final document in the case file was a letter from the mayor's office thanking Detective Rodriguez for his thorough investigation and thoughtful recommendations, and noting that the Community Safety Partnership program had become one of the city's most successful initiatives for improving public safety through collaborative approaches that combined official resources with volunteer expertise and community knowledge. Archivist Walsh had completed her review of the case file on a quiet Friday afternoon, when the archive building was nearly empty and the autumn sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the rows of filing cabinets that contained decades of similar stories. The file had been officially closed and transferred to permanent storage, where it would join thousands of other cases that documented the ongoing effort to balance law enforcement with community needs. The process of filing the completed case had provided Archivist Walsh with an opportunity to reflect on the evolution she had witnessed during her 35 years in the records department. The cases from her early years had often focused on traditional criminal activities and conventional law enforcement responses, but the more recent files increasingly documented collaborative approaches that sought to address the root causes of crime through community partnership and volunteer initiative. Her final day of work had been spent organizing her office and preparing documentation that would help her successor understand the archive's organizational systems and the historical context that informed many of the older case files. The archive contained not just criminal justice records, but a comprehensive history of how the city had addressed challenges to public safety and community welfare over several decades of social and economic change. The building itself had become a monument to the patient work of documentation that had preserved the memory of thousands of investigations, interventions, and community responses to crime and disorder. Each file represented hours of careful observation, detailed interviewing, and thoughtful analysis, all preserved in the careful language of police reports and witness statements that had been filed away. to rest in the ordered silence of the archive. In retirement, archivist Walsh occasionally returned to visit the archive building, observing how new cases continued to arrive and how younger staff members maintained the systems she had helped develop over her long career. The building continued its quiet work of preservation, accepting new files while maintaining the older cases that documented the city's accumulated experience with the complex challenges of maintaining public safety while preserving individual rights and community autonomy. The archive had become a place where time moved differently, measured not in days or weeks, but in the longer rhythms of institutional memory and social change. The cases rested in their files like seeds in carefully tended soil, waiting for researchers who might someday need to understand how communities had addressed particular challenges or how effective partnerships had been developed between law enforcement agencies and the residents they served. The silence of the archive was not empty but full, containing the voices of thousands of witnesses, victims, officers, and community members who had contributed to the ongoing conversation between law and life that defined the relationship between police work and community welfare. Each file added its voice to this larger conversation, preserving not just the facts of individual cases, but the broader questions about justice, safety, and the responsibilities that citizens and officials shared for creating communities where everyone could live with dignity and security. The final light of each day filtered through the archive windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above filing cabinets containing stories that would outlast the people who had created them, preserved for future generations who might need to understand how their predecessors had wrestled with the eternal challenges of balancing individual freedom with collective security, law with mercy, and justice with compassion. James Morrison had been appointed as the new head archivist 3 months after Margaret Walsh's retirement, inheriting not just her office and responsibilities, but the accumulated wisdom of 35 years spent tending to the city's criminal justice memory. The transition had been gradual and careful, with Walsh spending her final weeks sharing the unwritten knowledge that governed the archive's daily operations, the subtle understanding of how cases connected across decades and how individual files contributed to larger patterns of community life. The archive building continued its quiet work unchanged by the QCO transfer of responsibility from one caretaker to another. The filing cabinets maintained their orderly rows. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant tune, and the morning sunlight still cast familiar patterns across the polished floors where countless investigators had walked while researching cases that stretched back through the city's documented history. Morrison's first major case had arrived on a Tuesday morning in January 2003, delivered by Detective Amanda Park, who had requested assistance in researching background information for an investigation that seemed to echo patterns from cases that had been filed years or decades earlier. The current case involved reports of beneficial activities occurring throughout the city, improvements and repairs that were being completed anonymously, without official authorization, but with obvious positive impact on community welfare. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had studied the archive's contents carefully. Morrison had spent his first months reviewing case summaries and learning to recognize the recurring themes that appeared in different forms across different eras. The way communities generated unofficial responses to problems that official agencies couldn't or wouldn't address, and how these responses often attracted law enforcement attention before being recognized as positive contributions to public welfare. Detective Park's case file documented reports from 14 different neighborhoods where residents had noticed improvements to public spaces, repairs to damaged infrastructure, and enhancements to safety features that had appeared overnight without any obvious explanation. The work was consistently professional in quality, used appropriate materials and techniques, and address genuine needs that had been documented through citizen complaints and official requests that had not yet been addressed. Through normal municipal channels, the investigation had revealed that the anonymous improvements were being coordinated through an online network that connected skilled volunteers with community members who had identified problems requiring attention. The network operated through encrypted communications and careful scheduling that allowed volunteers to complete their work without attracting attention or creating liability issues for the property owners who benefited from their efforts. Morrison's research into the archive's historical cases had provided Detective Park with crucial context for understanding how similar volunteer networks had operated in previous decades and how law enforcement had successfully addressed the legal and administrative challenges they presented. The archive contained detailed documentation of at least 6 previous cases where informal community improvement networks had been investigated, understood, and ultimately formalized into official partnerships with municipal agencies. The research had led to the identification of patterns that connected current volunteer activities with historical precedents, revealing that the city had a long tradition of citizens taking direct action to address infrastructure problems and safety concerns. When official responses were delayed or inadequate, the archive's case files provided a roadmap for developing legal and administrative frameworks that could support volunteer efforts while ensuring proper coordination with official agencies. Detective Park's investigation had concluded with the establishment of formal partnerships between the volunteer network and appropriate city departments, creating structures that preserve the efficiency and responsiveness of unofficial efforts while providing legal protection and resource support that allowed the network to expand its activities and serve additional communities throughout the metropolitan area. Morrison's experience with the case had demonstrated how the archive served not just as a storage facility for completed investigations, but as an active resource for current law enforcement work, providing historical context and practical guidance for officers dealing with contemporary challenges that had roots in recurring patterns of community behavior and social response. Case files continued to arrive at Morrison's desk throughout his first year, each one carrying stories that would eventually join the archive's accumulated collection, but that first served as working documents for ongoing investigations. The rhythm of case openings and closures provided a constant reminder of the archive's dual role as both historical repository and practical resource for current police work. Asterisk. Spring brought a case involving community gardens that were appearing in vacant lots throughout the city, carefully maintained plots that were producing food for neighborhood residents, while creating informal gathering spaces that served social and educational functions. The investigation had revealed a network of urban agriculture enthusiasts who were transforming unused spaces into productive resources with the permission of property owners who appreciated the improvements to their vacant land. Summer had delivered files documenting volunteer safety patrols that were providing informal security services in neighborhoods where official police presence was limited by resource constraints and competing priorities. The patrols were staffed by trained volunteers who understood the boundaries of their authority and who worked in careful coordination with official law enforcement to enhance community safety without interfering with professional police operations. Autumn's cases had included investigations of anonymous scholarship programs that were providing educational opportunities for young people whose families couldn't afford college tuition or vocational training. The programs were funded through private donations and administered through nonprofit organizations that protected the anonymity of both donors and recipients while ensuring that financial Assistance reached students who demonstrated both need and potential for success. Each case had required research into historical precedents and legal frameworks, work that drew on the archive's accumulated documentation of how similar initiatives had been addressed in previous decades. Morrison's research revealed consistent patterns in how communities generated unofficial responses to social challenges and how law enforcement agencies had learned to distinguish between genuinely beneficial activities and potentially problematic behavior that required intervention or redirection. Winter brought the archive's annual inventory process, a systematic review of all cases that had been closed during the previous year, and a comprehensive assessment of the storage and preservation systems that maintained the collection's integrity over time. Morrison had used the inventory as an opportunity to study the archive's organizational principles and to understand how individual cases contributed to the larger patterns that characterized the city's criminal justice history. The inventory had revealed that approximately 60% of recent cases involved investigations that had concluded with community partnerships, collaborative solutions, or recognition of beneficial activities that had initially appeared suspicious to outside observers. The pattern suggested that the city's residents had developed sophisticated informal systems for addressing social challenges and that law enforcement agencies had learned to identify and support these systems rather than simply regulate or prohibit them. Morrison's first annual report had documented the archive's continuing evolution, from a passive storage facility to an active research resource that supported contemporary police work while preserving the historical documentation that provided context for understanding current community dynamics. The report had noted that the archive's case files were increasingly being consulted by academic researchers, policy analysts, and community organizations seeking to understand effective approaches to collaboration between official agencies and volunteer initiatives. The building itself had adapted to its expanded role, with new research facilities created to accommodate visiting scholars and improved cataloging systems that made historical cases more accessible to current investigators. The archive had become a bridge between past and present, connecting the accumulated experience of previous decades with current efforts to address persistent challenges in community safety and social welfare. As Morrison's first year concluded and his second began, the archive continued to receive new cases while maintaining its historical collections, serving as both memory and resource for a community that had learned to value the documentation of its successes and failures in addressing the complex challenges of urban life. The files rested in their ordered rows, each one contributing to a larger understanding of how communities could work together to create conditions that supported safety, prosperity, and mutual care. The archive's work continued in its quiet rhythm of preservation and access, accepting new stories while maintaining older ones, serving researchers while supporting active investigations, holding the past while nurturing the future. Through the patient documentation of human efforts to create communities where everyone could live with dignity and hope, the basement held secrets that even the archive's catalog couldn't fully capture. Boxes of evidence from cases so old their original investigators had become stories themselves, 3 floors beneath James Morrison's office, in the building's deepest level where the foundation met bedrock and the city's oldest infrastructure carried water and electricity through tunnels that predated the archive by decades, lay storage rooms that contained the physical evidence from cases dating back to the 1940s. The basement had been designed as temporary storage, a place where evidence could rest while cases worked their way through the court system. But time and bureaucracy had transformed it into something approaching an archaeological site. The basement's fluorescent lighting had been installed during the building's construction and had developed the particular flicker that characterized aging electrical systems, creating an environment where shadows moved subtly across rows of metal shelving that extended into darkness beyond the reach of the inadequate illumination. The air carried the scent of old cardboard, metal oxidizing slowly in humid conditions, and the faint chemical smell of photographic materials that had been stored for decades. Without proper climate control, that evidence room B7 contained materials from cases that had been investigated during the 1960s, a decade when the city had been smaller and police work had been more personal, conducted by officers who knew their neighborhoods with the intimacy that came from walking the same beats for years and developing relationships with residents that extended across generations of families. The evidence boxes from that era were smaller and fewer, reflecting a time when criminal investigations relied more on witness testimony and local knowledge than on scientific analysis and technical documentation. Box B7 to 293 contained evidence from a case that had been investigated by Detective Harold Chun during the winter of 1963, a series of incidents that had occurred in the Westbridge neighborhood, when it had been a working-class community of modest houses occupied by families who had moved to the city seeking employment in the factories and warehouses that had then provided the economic foundation for much of the metropolitan area. The case had begun with reports from Mrs. Dorothy Williams, an elderly woman who lived alone in a small house on Elm Street and who had contacted police to report that someone had been entering her home during the day while she was at work, not to steal anything, but apparently to perform household tasks that she had been unable to manage herself. The intruder had been washing dishes, organizing closets, and completing small repairs around the house, always working with obvious care and attention to her preferences and routines. Detective Chun's investigation had expanded when similar reports came from other elderly residents in the neighborhood, all describing the same pattern of helpful intrusion that left their homes cleaner and better organized, but that violated their sense of security and privacy in ways that made them uncomfortable, despite the obvious benefits they received from the anonymous assistance. The evidence box contained Detective Chun's handwritten notes from his interviews with 7 different victims, each describing their complex feelings about receiving help they needed but hadn't requested from someone whose identity and motivations remained mysterious. The notes were written in the careful cursive script that had been standard in police reports before typewriters became common equipment in precinct stations. Each letter formed with the patience of an officer who understood that documentation might be the only lasting record of events that had disrupted the quiet routines of ordinary citizens. Mrs. Agnes Murphy, who lived in a small apartment above the neighborhood bakery, had described finding that someone had repaired her broken kitchen faucet and had reorganized her pantry according to a system that was actually more efficient than the one she had been using. Her statement, preserved in Detective Chun's careful handwriting, revealed her gratitude for the assistance mixed with her anxiety about the idea that someone had been in her private space without her knowledge or permission. Investigation had revealed that the helpful intruder was Mr. Frank Patterson, a middle-aged man who worked as a janitor at the local elementary school and who had been using his knowledge of the neighborhood's elderly residents to identify people who might benefit from assistance with household tasks that had become difficult for them to manage independently. Patterson had been entering the houses through doors that residents had left unlocked, a common practice in a neighborhood where people felt safe and where mutual assistance was an accepted part of community life. Detective Chun's interview with Patterson, recorded in notes that filled several pages of the evidence file, had revealed the complex motivations behind the helpful break-ins. Patterson had explained that his work at the elementary school had made him aware of how many neighborhood children were being raised by elderly grandparents who struggled with the physical demands of maintaining their homes while caring for young family members. His assistance was intended to help these elderly residents maintain their independence and continue providing stable homes for the children who depended on them. The case had been resolved when Detective Chun arranged a meeting between Patterson and the residents who had been receiving his assistance, allowing them to discuss the situation directly and to develop an arrangement that preserved Patterson's desire to help while respecting the residents' need for security and privacy. The meeting had taken place in the basement of St. Mary's Church, a location that all parties considered neutral and appropriate for discussing community concerns. The evidence box contained photographs that Detective Chun had taken during the community meeting. Black and white images that captured the moment when neighbors who had lived near each other for years were finally able to discuss their individual challenges and their shared resources for addressing them. The photographs showed faces marked by the economic hardships that characterized working-class life during the 1960s. But they also revealed the dignity and mutual respect that had made it possible for the community to develop its own solutions to problems that might have otherwise required official intervention. The resolution had involved the establishment of a formal network of volunteers who provided assistance to elderly residents through arrangements that preserved privacy and security while ensuring that people received the help they needed to maintain their independence. Patterson had become the coordinator of this network, using his knowledge of the community to match volunteers with residents who could benefit from assistance with specific tasks or challenges. Box B 7-294 contained evidence from a related case that Detective Chun had investigated several months later. When reports came from the elementary school where Patterson worked that someone had been making unauthorized improvements to the building during evening and weekend hours. The improvements included repairs to playground equipment, organization of supply closets, and cleaning of areas that were not covered by the school's regular maintenance schedule. The investigation had revealed that Patterson had been working with several other community members to address maintenance needs at the school that were not being met due to budget constraints and bureaucratic delays. The volunteer work had been performed with the same careful attention to quality and safety that had characterized Patterson's assistance to elderly residents, and had resulted in significant improvements to the educational environment without any cost to the school district. The evidence from both cases had been preserved in the basement storage room for 40 years, waiting for researchers who might someday need to understand how communities in earlier decades had addressed challenges related to aging, community care, and the maintenance of public institutions. The photographs, interview notes, and physical evidence provided a detailed record of how one neighborhood had developed its own systems for mutual assistance and collective responsibility. James Morrison had discovered the basement evidence rooms during his second year as head archivist, when a water leak in the building's foundation had required inspection of storage areas that had not been accessed for many years. The discovery had led to a comprehensive cataloging project that revealed thousands of pieces of evidence from cases that had been resolved decades earlier but that had never been properly integrated into the archive's main collection. The basement materials had provided Morrison with new insights into the historical patterns that characterized the city's approach to community challenges, revealing that many contemporary volunteer networks and informal assistance programs had roots in activities that had been investigated and formalized during previous decades. The basement evidence had become a resource for understanding how community-based solutions to social problems had evolved over time and how law enforcement agencies had learned to recognize and support beneficial activities that initially appeared suspicious or problematic. The cataloging project had required months of careful work to organize and preserve materials that had been stored without adequate climate control or proper archival procedures. Many documents had suffered damage from humidity and temperature fluctuations, but Morrison had been able to work with conservation specialists to stabilize the most important materials and to create digital copies that would preserve their contents for future researchers. The project had revealed that the basement contained evidence from more than 800 cases that had been investigated between 1940 and 1980, a period during which the city's approach to law enforcement had been more personal and community-focused than the specialized technical methods that had become standard in later decades. The evidence provided a detailed record of how police work had been conducted during an era when officers were expected to understand and participate in the social fabric of the neighborhoods they served. The basement's treasures had included photograph collections that documented the city's physical transformation over 40 years, showing neighborhoods as they had appeared before urban renewal projects had replaced older buildings with modern structures. The images provided visual evidence of how communities had been organized around institutions and gathering places that no longer existed, revealing patterns of social interaction and mutual support that had been disrupted by subsequent development and population changes. Morrison's work in the basement had become a form of archaeological investigation, uncovering layers of the city's criminal justice history that had been forgotten or overlooked during subsequent decades of administrative reorganization and technological change. The evidence rooms had become windows into approaches to law enforcement and community relations that might provide valuable guidance for contemporary challenges that seemed new but that had actually been addressed successfully in earlier eras. The basement continued to yield discoveries as Morrison's cataloging work progressed, each storage room revealing new insights into how previous generations had balanced individual rights with community welfare, official authority with citizen initiative, and law enforcement with social support. The evidence preserved in those dim storage rooms had become a resource for understanding how communities could work together to address persistent challenges while maintaining the relationships and institutions that supported collective life and individual dignity. Archives Research Room had been established on the second floor of the building, positioned between the active case files on the third floor and the historical collections on the first, creating a space where past and present could meet in the careful work of scholarly investigation. The room contained 8 wooden tables surrounded by chairs that had been donated by the city library when it had modernized its furniture, and the walls were lined with reference materials that helped researchers navigate the archive's complex organizational systems. Natural light entered through tall windows that faced south toward the University District, where many of the archive's visitors worked as professors, graduate students, and independent researchers who had discovered that police files contained rich documentation of social history that was rarely available through other sources. The morning light created a peaceful atmosphere that encouraged the kind of patient, detailed work that archival research required, and the room's quiet ambiance made it conducive to the long hours of reading and note-taking that characterized serious scholarly INVESTIGATIO, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez had been visiting the Archive Research Room twice weekly for 6 months, working on a book about community responses to crime during the 1970s and 1980s that would examine how neighborhoods had developed their own approaches to safety and security before community policing became an official law enforcement strategy. Her research had revealed that many innovations in police-community relations had originated not in academic theories or official policies, but in practical solutions developed by officers and residents who had worked together to address specific local challenges. Dr. Rodriguez's project had begun with her discovery that the archive contained detailed documentation of community-based crime prevention initiatives that had been largely forgotten despite their apparent success in reducing crime and improving police community relations in several neighborhoods throughout the city. Her research had revealed that these initiatives had often emerged from informal collaborations between individual officers and community members who had developed personal relationships that extended beyond the traditional boundaries of law enforcement work. The case that had become central to Dr. Rodriguez's research involved the Riverside neighborhood during the late 1970s, when Detective Maria Santos had worked with residents to address a series of burglaries that had been targeting elderly residents who lived alone in houses that had become isolated as younger families had moved to newer suburbs. The traditional approach of increasing patrols and encouraging residents to improve their home security had been only partially successful, and Detective Santos had begun exploring alternative strategies that addressed the social isolation that made elderly residents particularly vulnerable to crime. Detective Santos's case files documented her systematic efforts to understand how the burglaries were affecting not just the immediate victims but the broader community's sense of safety and social cohesion. Her reports included detailed interviews with elderly residents who described how fear of crime had led them to withdraw from community activities and social interactions that had previously provided meaning and structure to their daily lives. The investigation had revealed that the burglaries were being committed by teenagers who lived in the neighborhood and who had targeted houses where they knew elderly residents lived alone and were unlikely to be able to provide effective resistance or reliable witness testimony. The crimes were opportunistic rather than carefully planned, but they had created a climate of fear that was affecting the entire community's quality of life and social functioning. Detective Santos's innovative approach had involved organizing informal gatherings where elderly residents could meet their younger neighbors and develop relationships that would make it less likely that young people would view them as anonymous targets for criminal activity. The gatherings had taken place in community spaces such as church basements and school cafeterias, and had focused on activities that allowed different generations to interact around shared interests and mutual assistance. Dr. Rodriguez's research had documented the causes impactor. Rodriguez's research had documented the can choose evolution of these intergenerational gatherings from simple social events to comprehensive community support networks that addressed not just crime prevention but broader issues related to social isolation, economic hardship, and the maintenance of neighborhood institutions. The archive's case files contained detailed records of how the program had been implemented, evaluated, and eventually formalized as a model that was replicated in other neighborhoods throughout the city. The success of Detective Santos's approach had been measured not just in reduced crime statistics but in improved social cohesion and community resilience that had made the neighborhood more attractive to families and had contributed to economic development that benefited residents across all age groups. The archive's documentation showed that the program had created lasting changes in how residents related to each other and how they understood their collective responsibility for community safety and welfare. Dr. Rodriguez had spent considerable time interviewing Detective Santos, who had retired from police work but who remained active in community organizations that had grown out of her original crime prevention initiatives. The interviews had provided Dr. Rodriguez with insights into how individual officers could serve as catalysts for community development that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement activities, and how police work could contribute to social healing and community building rather than simply focusing on crime suppression and punishment. The research room had also been used by graduate students who were studying various aspects of criminal justice history and community development. Sarah Kim, a doctoral candidate in sociology, had been researching how informal economic networks had operated in working-class neighborhoods during periods of high unemployment, examining police files that documented investigations into activities that had initially appeared criminal, but that had been revealed as community survival strategies that helped families maintain their economic stability during difficult periods. Kim's research had focused on the 1980s, when plant closures and economic restructuring had eliminated many manufacturing jobs that had provided stable employment for neighborhood residents. Police files from that period contained documentation of various informal economic activities that had emerged as people sought ways to supplement their reduced incomes or replace lost employment opportunities. The case files had revealed networks of informal services that included everything from unlicensed childcare and home repair services to small-scale food production and distribution systems that operated outside official regulatory frameworks but that provided essential resources for families who could not afford to purchase these services through formal commercial channels. The police investigations had initially focused on potential violations of business licensing requirements and tax obligations, but the files showed that many officers had recognized that the informal economic activities were serving legitimate needs and were contributing to community stability rather than threatening public welfare. The investigations had often concluded with referrals to agencies that could help informal service providers comply with regulations while continuing their community-oriented work. Kim's research had documented how these informal economic networks had eventually evolved into formal cooperative businesses and nonprofit organizations that continued to serve their communities while operating within official, legal and regulatory frameworks. The police files had provided crucial documentation of how grassroots economic development had occurred in response to economic disruption, and how law enforcement agencies had learned to distinguish between legitimate community initiatives and genuinely problematic activities that required intervention. The research room had become a place where these historical patterns were studied and analyzed by scholars who understood that police files contained valuable information about social processes and community resilience that was not readily available through other documentary sources. The researchers who worked in the room had developed an appreciation for the detailed observation and careful documentation that characterized good police work, and they had learned to read investigative reports as windows into community life and social dynamics that might otherwise remain invisible to academic study. James Morrison had observed that the research room served an important function in connecting the archive's historical materials with contemporary efforts to understand and address persistent social challenges. The scholars who worked in the room often shared their findings with current police officers and community organizations, creating connections between past experience and present practice that enriched both historical understanding and current policy development. The research room had become a bridge between the archive's role as a repository of historical documentation and its function as a resource for addressing contemporary challenges. The quiet work of scholarship that took place around its wooden tables contributed to a broader understanding of how communities had addressed difficult challenges in previous eras, providing insights that could inform current efforts to build safer, more resilient neighborhoods where residents could work together to address shared concerns while maintaining individual freedom and community diversity. The afternoon light that streamed through the research rooms windows illuminated scholars who were engaged in the patient work of reading and analysis that transforms raw documentation into historical understanding and practical wisdom. Their work ensured that the stories preserved in the archive's files would continue to contribute to ongoing conversations about community, safety, and the complex relationships between law enforcement and the residents it serves. The scanning room occupied a corner of the archive's third floor, equipped with specialized equipment designed to capture high-resolution images of documents, photographs, and physical evidence while preserving the original materials from the damage that could result from repeated handling. The work required patience and technical precision, as each document needed to be positioned carefully under bright lights that revealed every detail of handwriting, typography, and the physical deterioration that had occurred during decades of storage. Lisa Chun had been hired as the archive's digital preservation specialist, bringing expertise in both historical documentation and modern information technology that allowed her to understand how digital copies could preserve the content of physical records while maintaining the contextual information that was often lost when documents were reduced to simple electronic files. Her work involved more than technical scanning. It required understanding how the physical characteristics of documents contributed to their meaning and historical value. The conversion project had begun with the most fragile materials, photographs and documents from the 1950s and earlier, that were beginning to show signs of chemical deterioration that would eventually make them unreadable if they were not preserved through digital copying. The process of scanning each document required careful examination that revealed details about how police work had been conducted during earlier eras, when officers had relied on manual typewriters, carbon paper, and photographic techniques that required considerable skill and patience. Detective William Morrison's case files from the 1950s provided particularly rich examples of how investigative documentation had been created during an era when officers had been expected to be skilled, not just in law enforcement, but in the technical aspects of creating permanent records that could serve as evidence in court proceedings and as historical documentation of their investigative work. His handwritten notes were models of clarity and organization, demonstrating how officers had been trained to create documents that would remain useful decades after the cases had been closed. Case File 541847 documented Detective Morrison's investigation of unusual activities in the Elmwood neighborhood during the summer of 1954, when residents had begun reporting that someone had been quietly maintaining public spaces and private property without authorization or acknowledgement. The activities included weeding and watering gardens, repairing broken fences and sidewalks, and cleaning up areas where litter and debris had accumulated beyond the capacity of official municipal maintenance services. The case had begun with reports from Mrs. Catherine Walsh, who lived in a house on Oak Street, and who had noticed that her front garden was being tended by someone who worked during the early morning hours when most residents were still asleep. The unknown gardener had been weeding flower beds, pruning bushes, and watering plants with obvious skill and attention to the specific needs of different plant varieties. The work had been done with such care that Mrs. Walsh's garden had never looked better, but she had been concerned about the implications of having someone on her property without her knowledge or permission. Detective Morrison's investigation had revealed that similar maintenance activities were occurring throughout the neighborhood, with residents discovering that various aspects of their property upkeep were being handled by an unknown person who seemed to possess both considerable skill and intimate knowledge of each household's specific maintenance needs and aesthetic preferences. The scanning process had revealed details in Detective Morrison's photographs that had not been apparent when the images were viewed as physical prints. Digital enhancement allowed Lisa Chun to examine the crime scene photographs at levels of magnification that revealed the quality and technique of the anonymous maintenance work, showing that the unknown gardener had been using professional tools and methods that suggested formal training in horticulture and landscape maintenance. The investigation had intensified when Detective Morrison realized that the maintenance activities were occurring on a systematic basis, with the unknown individual apparently maintaining a regular schedule that ensured that all affected properties received appropriate care according to seasonal needs and plant-specific requirements. The level of organization and expertise suggested that the activities were being conducted by someone with considerable professional experience who was donating their skills to improve the neighborhood's appearance and property values. Detective Morrison's case notes, now preserved in digital form that would ensure their survival for future generations, documented his methodical approach to identifying the anonymous maintenance worker through careful observation and analysis of the patterns revealed by the work itself. His investigation had focused not on surveillance techniques that might have been intrusive or disruptive to neighborhood life, but on understanding the work well enough to predict where and when the next maintenance activities were likely to occur. The breakthrough had come when Detective Morrison encountered the maintenance worker directly, discovering that the mysterious gardener was Mr. Henry Kim, a retired landscape architect who had worked for the city's Parks Department for 30 years before taking early retirement due to budget cuts that had eliminated his position. Mr. Kim had been using his professional skills and his extensive knowledge of plant care to maintain neighborhood gardens and green spaces that were suffering from neglect due to residents' age, illness, or economic constraints. The digital scanning process had captured not just the text of Mr. Kim's statement, but the subtle variations in Detective Morrison's handwriting that revealed his emotional response to the interview, showing how officers of that era had been expected to maintain professional objectivity while remaining sensitive to the human dimensions of the cases they investigated. The physical documents contained information about the investigative process that could not be conveyed through digital text alone. Detective Morrison's final report had documented his recommendation that no charges be filed against Mr. Kim, whose activities had clearly been beneficial to the community and had been conducted with obvious care and professional expertise. The report had noted that Mr. Kim's volunteer work had improved property values throughout the neighborhood while providing him with meaningful activity that utilized his professional skills in service to his community. The case had been resolved when Detective Morrison arranged for Mr. Kim to meet with the residents who had been benefiting from his work, leading to the establishment of a formal volunteer program that allowed him to continue his neighborhood improvement activities with the explicit permission and support of property owners who appreciated his contributions to their community's appearance and livability. Lisa Chun's work on the digital conversion project had revealed that many cases from the 1950s had involved similar volunteer activities by skilled retirees who had found ways to continue contributing to their communities through informal service. Projects that addressed genuine needs while utilizing professional expertise that might otherwise have been lost when workers left their official positions. The pattern suggested that communities had developed sophisticated systems for integrating the skills and knowledge of retired workers into ongoing maintenance and improvement activities. The scanning process had also revealed the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized police documentation during that era, when officers had been expected to create records that would serve not just as evidence in legal proceedings but as comprehensive accounts of community events and social dynamics that might be important for understanding how neighborhoods functioned and how residents addressed collective challenges. The digital copies that resulted from Lisa Chun's work would ensure that these detailed records remained accessible to future researchers and community members who might need to understand how previous generations had addressed challenges related to aging, retirement, and the maintenance of community infrastructure. The conversion project had become a bridge between the physical documents that contained the original information and the digital systems that would preserve that information for use by people who might never have access to the original materials. The scanning room's bright lights and technical equipment had created an environment where the past and future met in the careful work of preservation, ensuring that stories documented on fragile paper and aging photographs would continue to inform discussions about community development, volunteer service, and the complex relationships between individual initiative and collective welfare. Each scanned document had become both historical artifact and contemporary resource, carrying forward the wisdom embedded in careful investigation and thoughtful documentation that had been created by officers who understood that their work contributed to the ongoing conversation between past experience and present challenges. The fourth floor of the archive building had been converted into a training facility where the police department's continuing education program used historical case files as teaching materials for officers who needed to understand how community-oriented approaches to law enforcement had evolved over time. The space combined the quiet atmosphere that characterized the rest of the building with the interactive energy of a classroom where EXPERIENCED officers shared their knowledge with colleagues who were beginning their careers or transitioning to new assignments. Commander Patricia Santos had developed the archive-based training program after recognizing that many contemporary challenges in police community relations had been addressed successfully in previous decades through approaches that had been forgotten or abandoned as law enforcement had become more centralized and technology-focused. Her program used historical case files to demonstrate how individual officers had developed innovative solutions to persistent problems, providing current officers with practical examples of effective community engagement techniques. The training room contained tables arranged in a semicircle that allowed participants to examine historical documents while maintaining eye contact with instructors and fellow officers. During group discussions, the walls were lined with enlarged photographs from significant cases, images that provided visual context for the written documentation and that helped officers understand how neighborhoods and community dynamics had changed over the decades covered by the archive's collections. Officer Jennifer Martinez had been selected to participate in the program during her third year of patrol duty, when her supervisors had identified her as someone who demonstrated natural ability in community engagement and who might benefit from studying historical approaches to building trust between police officers and the residents they served. The 6-week program required participants to spend one day each week reviewing case files and discussing their findings with experienced officers who had worked in similar situations. The case that had been assigned to Officer Martinez during her first week involved Detective Robert Kim's investigation of community garden activities in the Riverside neighborhood during the 1980s, when residents had begun creating small agricultural plots in vacant lots without obtaining the permits and authorizations that were technically required for such activities. The case files documented how Detective Kim had approached the situation as an opportunity to strengthen police community relations rather than simply enforcing regulations that might have eliminated beneficial community activities. Detective Kim's approach had begun with extensive consultation with community members who were involved in the garden projects, seeking to understand their motivations and objectives before making decisions about whether official intervention was necessary or appropriate. His investigation had revealed that the gardens were addressing genuine needs for fresh produce in a neighborhood where grocery stores were limited and expensive, while also providing recreational and social opportunities for residents who had few alternatives for outdoor activities and community interaction. The case files included detailed maps that Detective Kim had created showing the locations of various garden plots and the demographics of the families who were participating in the agricultural activities. His documentation had revealed that the gardens were serving multiple functions beyond simple food production, creating informal gathering places where neighbors could meet and socialize, educational opportunities where children could learn about plant cultivation and nutrition, and volunteer activities that allowed elderly residents to contribute their knowledge and experience to community projects. Officer Martinez had been particularly impressed by Detective Kim's systematic approach to understanding the regulatory framework that governed land use in the neighborhood, research that had allowed him to identify legal mechanisms that could authorize the garden activities while ensuring that they met safety and environmental standards. His work had required coordination with multiple city agencies, but he had approached these bureaucratic challenges as opportunities to build partnerships between law enforcement and other municipal departments. The resolution of the garden case had involved the creation of a formal community land use program that provided legal status for resident-initiated improvement projects while maintaining appropriate oversight to ensure public safety and environmental protection. Detective Kim's careful documentation had been essential to developing policies that preserved the community-oriented character of the garden projects while addressing the legitimate regulatory concerns that had initially prompted the investigation. Officer Martinez's analysis of the case had focused on Detective Kim's communication strategies, examining how he had built trust with community members who were initially suspicious of police involvement in their voluntary activities. His approach had emphasized patient listening and genuine curiosity about community concerns, demonstrating respect for residents' knowledge and experience while providing information about legal requirements and available resources that could support their projects. The training program had included visits to several of the original garden sites, allowing current officers to see how Detective Kim's work had contributed to long-term community development that continued to benefit residents decades after the original investigation had been completed. The gardens had evolved into a network of community-supported agriculture projects that provided food security for hundreds of families while maintaining the social and educational functions that had made them important to neighborhood life. Commander Santos had designed the program to help officers understand that effective police work often required patience and long-term thinking that extended beyond immediate law enforcement objectives. The historical cases demonstrated how individual officers could serve as catalysts for positive community change by approaching apparent violations as opportunities to understand community needs and to develop creative solutions that addressed underlying issues, rather than simply imposing regulatory compliance. The second case assigned to Officer Martinez had involved Detective Angela Foster's investigation of informal childcare networks that had operated in working-class neighborhoods during the 1970s, when economic pressures had required many parents to work multiple jobs while struggling to afford commercial childcare services. The networks had operated outside official licensing requirements, but had provided safe, reliable childcare that allowed families to maintain employment while ensuring that children received appropriate supervision and care. Detective Foster's approach had focused on evaluating the quality and safety of the informal childcare arrangements rather than simply determining whether they complied with official regulations. Her investigation had included interviews with parents, children, and caregivers, as well as careful observation of the physical environments and daily routines that characterized the informal childcare operations. The case files had documented Detective Foster's conclusion that the informal networks were providing childcare services that met or exceeded the quality standards maintained by many licensed facilities, while also offering cultural and linguistic continuity that was particularly important for immigrant families who wanted their children to maintain connections to their heritage and community traditions. The resolution had involved working with state licensing agencies to develop alternative certification processes that recognize the skills and experience of informal childcare providers while ensuring that children received appropriate protection and educational opportunities. Detective Foster's work had contributed to policy changes that made it easier for community-based childcare networks to operate legally while maintaining the flexibility and cultural sensitivity that had made them effective resources for working families. Officer Martinez's participation in the training program had changed her understanding of police work from a primarily reactive profession focused on responding to criminal activity, to a more proactive approach that emphasized building relationships and understanding community dynamics that could prevent problems before they required enforcement interventions. The historical cases had provided her with practical examples of how individual officers could contribute to community development and social problem solving through careful investigation, creative thinking, and genuine commitment to serving community welfare. The archive-based training program had become a model for other police departments that were seeking to develop community-oriented approaches to law enforcement, demonstrating how historical documentation could serve as a resource for contemporary professional development. The program had created connections between retired officers who had developed innovative approaches during their careers and current officers who were facing similar challenges in different contexts. The training sessions concluded each month with group discussions where participants reflected on how historical approaches might be adapted to contemporary situations, considering how changes in technology, demographics, and social conditions affected the implementation of community-oriented policing strategies. These conversations had generated new ideas for current community engagement initiatives while preserving institutional memory of successful approaches that might otherwise have been lost as experienced officers retired and new personnel joined the department. The archive building's role as a training facility had transformed it from a passive repository of historical documentation into an active resource for professional development and community engagement, demonstrating how carefully preserved records of past experience could inform current practice and contribute to ongoing innovation in law enforcement, approaches that served both public safety and community welfare.